Hey, Bitcoin wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 70. It's Friday, and we are live to discuss everything that has happened this week in Bitcoin, in macro, and geopolitics. Now, I'm in a little bit of a storm today, so we might be a little bit choppy. If so, Azad will jump in and let me know. But the show must go on because so much has happened this week, as usual. If you watched last week's episode, we tried something new. We chopped these videos up into 3 different sections. So those that want to watch the Bitcoin section, they can watch the Bitcoin section, the macro section separately, and the geopolitical section. So we'll try and do the same this week as well. But this week, we're going to be covering everything about the dirty, filthy, stinking money of USAID. Now that everything that we have been discussing, that I have been revealing for 14 years about the proof of weapons network, ever since I started this channel or uploaded my first video, I think it was back in 2010 or something. But everything I've been revealing about the proof of weapons network, it is all being revealed. And you might be distracted with what they want you to think about, like sending condoms and various other things with USAID. But don't miss the big things, because we have got categoric proof and confirmation of the dirty, filthy wars of the proof of weapons network that prop up the dollar in order to create wealth inequality within America, that also gets the world in debt slavery and exports inflation globally in order to fund the wars that overthrow the governments that cause so much death and destruction. Is why we call the fiat currency proof of weapons network, ever since the dirty Bank of England got its mitts on the pound and the Federal Reserve got its mitts on the dollar and turned it into unconstitutional money. And in 2008, we had to do a resistance with peaceful Bitcoin proof of work in order to fight back against it. And as more and more people are finding the freedom or being able to own your own money, spend your own money, and beat the dirty inflation of the Federal Reserve that puts people in debt slavery in perpetuity, then the more and more people are getting their freedom, and we want more and more people to experience it as we fully transition into a world of Bitcoin, AI, and CBDCs. Now, I've got to deconstruct everything that happened this week because we are moving at a rapid pace. If you are still on zero Bitcoin, now is time to get the hell off zero Bitcoin and wake up, because Bitcoin is becoming the resistance, the ability to be able to beat the proof of weapons network. And we need more and more people do it. So we're going to be discussing this week in Bitcoin, this week in macro, this week in geopolitics. But the theme is about the dirty money of USAID and how that relates to those 3 topics. So in the Bitcoin section, we're going to be going through some of the Bitcoin public companies and how they are eating up the traditional stock market and what I expect to see in the Trump administration in America and all the other capital markets around the world as well. In the macro section, we'll be discussing inflation, tariffs, and the dirty impact of USAID and how it relates to the macro side. And then finally, in the geopolitics section, we're going to go through Saudi Arabia's increasingly important role in ending the Ukraine-Russia and the Palestine-Israel conflicts that we are experiencing, that are complete functions of the deep state behind the proof of weapons network. The Fed sits at the top of the whole thing, which was a conduit, an implant into America from the Bank of England system in order to slowly transition America into a socialist, government-dependent country. And now we are seeing a big fight back and a resistance against that. But there is a competing force: artificial intelligence and central bank digital currencies. We are currently watching a massive transition from one evil to another evil, and Bitcoin is the solution for everybody. And everybody needs to make sure that they are stacking their sats every day, every week, every month, whatever's right for you. But just make sure that you are resisting against the proof of weapon network. Okay, now let's go straight into part 1, where we're going to be discussing this week in Bitcoin. So in the public Bitcoin companies, we had lots of earnings announcements, and we've only got a few of them that are part of the non-Bitcoin mining companies that are publicly traded on the most liquid capital market in the world, which is the United States, NASDAQ, and New York Stock Exchange. But Coinbase, which was a company I invested in early, and other Bank to the Future investors invested in the private equity thereof before it did the $100 billion IPO many, many years later, they have now reported $2.3 billion in revenue for Q4, and that is a 23% higher than expected. Now, I didn't dig too deep into any of the new reporting requirements that are now possible, but that was a 23% higher than expected, which sent the Coinbase price above most of the other stocks in the market. Another Bank to the Future portfolio company, when we invested in the private equity and I was a shareholder in, is Robinhood. Robinhood reported that it had brought in $350 million in revenue from crypto trading. Now compare that to the stock trading, which is their core product. It was $60 million for stock broking or stock trading, whatever they call that. That is a 6 times more revenue that came from the crypto part of the business, the Bitcoin and crypto part of the business, relative to their traditional stock. So a lot of other brokers are going to be seeing that. And now, while these come from two different models, Coinbase was a crypto company. At Bank to the Future, we ended up selling our US broker dealer to Coinbase because it wanted to adjust to being a traditional broker. But in the Biden administration, there was a very aggressive SEC lawsuit that was filed against it, and it couldn't use that broker dealer that it acquired from Bank to the Future, the company I co-founded in 2018. And Robinhood is the opposite. They came as a broker and they got into crypto. So there was these two different models, and then the SEC came after that model as well. But now we're in the Trump administration where they have a crypto SAR. And the crypto SAR has been announcing that it's going to be like trade unions type thing. I don't think trade unions is right. Trade groups, let's say. And then these trade groups are headed up by different people that are part of the ecosystem that all have an interest. And there is a frenzy of people that are all trying to get in there in order to make sure that their companies have the favorable type of representation that all the different parts of the ecosystem needs, as America aims to fulfill its mission of becoming the crypto capital of the world, while El Salvador reigns as the Bitcoin capital of the world. But I think a lot of other brokers are going to want to get into this. So we at Bank to the Future had 3 different brokers in the US, and none of them, we were able to use them in various different degrees. We allowed to get a lot of people into early funding rounds of many of the largest Bitcoin companies when they were a lot smaller as private equity. But none of them, as the hostile environment in the US prevailed, were able to do much. So we ended up selling those and various other things. Now we expect a turnaround. So make sure that the brokers are all going to be following the money. And if there is a path to registration, the floodgates are going to open. If they know that in the case of Robinhood, it is 6 times more profitable to offer your crypto services than your stock services. So watch out for that. Also, a meme coin stock, the original meme coin stock, let's call it, or meme stock, was GameStop, GME. GameStop, if you remember, it had that very famous activist movement where it was coming up against the Citadel shorter, and it wiped out the hedge fund industry and made it, through a short squeeze, lock in ginormous losses. And then it used its regulatory capture in order to co-opt the SEC, knock on the doors of the proof of weapons network, and but there was this bottom-up movement against it. And as a result of that, it's got this $4.6 billion balance sheet and not much of a business, because it's kind of a legacy business, which is a physical shop for gaming, but a rampant community. And they made an announcement this week that they are going to be using their balance sheet in order to potentially invest in Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, they called it. Now, one MicroStrategy has become, now known as Strategy, has become the cornerstone of the Bitcoin treasury strategy. It looks like GameStop could do something pretty interesting. Not my cup of tea, but it's got that kind of meme community where it would probably YOLO into all sorts of crazy crypto and create all sorts of craziness with a multi-billion-dollar balance sheet, a pro-crypto environment in the US, a public company, and a rampant community of memers and activists that want to YOLO into that stock and use some of the micro strategy type of learnings in order to create some of the craziest environments. Now, do remember, GameStop, just upon the announcement, the price of GameStop went up 20%. And there was a photo op between the GameStop CEO and Michael Saylor last week, there was one this week with Bukele, the president of El Salvador, and Michael Saylor meeting as well, creating a bit of speculation around what is happening there. But this could be an interesting play. Now, do remember, in 2022, when the Proof of Weapons Network through Operation Choke Point 2.0 wanted to implant, for example, SBF into the FTX Ponzi scheme, and the Israeli shell company Celsius that were headed up by Alex Majinsky, those frauds were able to use tokens in order to mark them to market to cover up their fraud. So as part of the regulatory environment ahead, there needs to be some clarity around how you discount certain illiquid assets as you start to go with less liquid assets than Bitcoin, which is incredibly, incredibly liquid. But remember, that is what gave the ability to manipulate those prices and hide all of the fraud that was happening and wipe out billions of dollars that was then weaponized by the Federal Reserve when they hiked rates, took out the crypto-friendly banks, and then used that in order to hand over a chunk of the industry to BlackRock and various other institutions as it executed a TradFi takeover of various parts of the ecosystem prior to the Trump administration. So now that all their buddies can make a shit ton of money from this industry, as we have seen time and time again with the Federal Reserve in the 20 different pump and dumps that it has been reported to have created since its inception in 1913, with the most infamous being the Roaring 20s that then led to the Great Depression of the 30s, which then led to the confiscation of American people's gold, which then leads to the questions around auditing the Federal Reserve, because it's likely that gold, the Treasury thinks they got gold, but the Federal Reserve may have used that as collateral and ended up stealing it from the American people, which becomes hugely relevant as we go through some of the scandals like USAID that are being exposed right now. I digress. Let's get back into the Bitcoin market. Now, meanwhile, in the other side of the world, in Japan, remember, Japan is a conduit of a post-World War II country that was occupied by the Bank of Japan, which was a member of the Bank for International Settlements that was created in the interwar periods between World War I and World War II. And when the New World Order was set up post-World War II, Bretton Woods, Germany became occupied by a debt-based Ponzi scheme. Japan became occupied by a debt-based Ponzi scheme, and Italy became occupied by a debt-based Ponzi scheme as it created the Proof of Weapons Network. And we ended up with what became later this Japan carry trade, where people can borrow at 0% from the Bank of Japan and use that to speculate on stocks and then create derivatives in order to hedge out some of the risks. Well, in order to resist against that, there are very large savings within Japan by the individuals. But public company Metaplanet, who Japan is one of the top stock markets in the world. It is now acquired 21,000 Bitcoin on its balance sheet, worth $2 billion. Basically, if you look at when it launched this Bitcoin strategy to where the price of that stock is today, it's up approximately 4,800% and beat every stock on the Japan stock exchange as well. So just like strategy, formerly MicroStrategy, beat every S&P stock by using a Bitcoin treasury strategy. We're seeing the same type of results within Japan, showing that it can be done in different countries as well. And now we're getting the Rumble type of experiment that we're seeing as well, and with private companies. And we're also getting the ones that we might be seeing with GameStop as well. But anyway, GameStop has $4.6 billion of cash balance. And at the same time, the originator of the public leverage the fiat currency proof of weapons network in order to invest into the inflation long-term resistant peaceful proof of work network Bitcoin strategy, has now bought this week another 7,633 Bitcoin worth. That's just under another $1 billion, $742 million. At the same time, another one of the early companies that raised finance through Bank to the Future with our investors. I'm a shareholder as well. Exodus, they rung the bell and they are now approaching, and they went over a $2.5 billion market cap as they went publicly traded. It had a little bit of a correction into the $2 billion market cap. But as we see more and more interest in public companies, now the market is growing and growing and growing. There were rumors about BitGo, which is a custodian. They help some of the exchanges custody their Bitcoin and provide API technology, MPC technology, basically under a corporate structure. You don't want to hold your own private keys as a director, but you do want to have a corporate structure whereby it requires like multi-factor authentication when you're storing client assets in custody, when you have fiduciary duties. And you want to be able to change that if a director leaves the company or, that type of governance structure. Well, BitGo was one of the first to provide that. And they're getting ready to do their initial public offering and join. There's rumors as well that they should be public later this year. Last round they did was at approximately $1.75 billion. That was their funding round. Lots of TradFi institutions. So they're looking, it looked like they may be one of the next companies, as well as some of our other portfolio companies that we invested in very early, like Circle, who's launched a USDC stablecoin, and others as well. I expect to see a wave of public offerings into the Trump administration as more and more companies go public. And you get to have a bit of an arbitrage between the traditional TradFi stock market and then some of the more exotic models. And we are starting to go more and more degen and exotic. As America said, we're not focused on Bitcoin, we're focused on crypto. So, as I said, remember the speculative attacks, like I was talking about with Celsius and FTX, by having a token that you mark to market. And then with GameStop, which is the original short squeeze, you can imagine the shenanigans that can happen when you have a simultaneous token at the same time as you have a stock price. Wait for it. It's going to happen. And we will see lots and lots of drama, and we'll always be covering it on Bitcoin Hard Talk. By the way, we're still trying to get to 100,000 subscribers on this channel. Do me a favor. If you're watching it, if everybody that watches this actually hit the subscribe button, hit the bell symbol and hit all, we're actually going to make sure that you get all the notifications. But YouTube is completely oppressing our content. We went through a very high growth phase. And when I started covering some of the geopolitical content that they don't want you to hear, we've just been stuck at this 91,000 because they don't want us to get to 100,000. Once we get to 100,000, we get a blue check. And then once we've got a blue check, they have to push that content out wider. So please help me fight the algorithm that we're fighting right now. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell symbol, hit all, so that I can make sure that we get more and more people to this message, especially as we seem to be revealing the truth now. I think we're moving away from an environment of censorship over to freedom of speech in order to feed the AI algorithm because they want the data. So I need this message to get out to as many people before AI completely takes over, as we've got this transition phase as well. Anyway, so remember the token share mark-to-market model. As companies like, for example, imagine Uniswap. if they're going public now that they settled with the SEC in this type of environment, and then they also have a token, imagine the games and the shenanigans that can happen. Now, speaking of shenanigans, we remember as part of the Biden administration and the attack upon the industry, there were certain victims that were creating software technology that were privacy enhancing, like Tornado Cash. And the co-founder of Tornado Cash was put in prison because the Biden administration and the Proof of Weapons Network decided that they wanted to have a headline case where the creators of self-custody software are held responsible for how the users use that. And this is a mechanism, just like we saw with the fake war on terror, where you end up with all sorts of Patriot Acts, called Patriot Act in order to remove your freedoms. They need a big case in order to take away your freedoms, and this was one of those. But that was reversed. So Alexei, sorry if I'm saying this wrong, Pertsev, sorry if I'm butchering your name. He was released from prison, and hopefully he will not be going back for creating technology. At the same time, we saw the grifters of the world, Central African Republic, an ex-colonial, try to break free from the French Empire, still under the Proof of Weapons Network of the French franc Proof of Weapons Network, that was later replaced by the European Central Bank and consolidated power, where the European Central Bank put together a Fed-first policy, destroying Europe, allowing it to get destroyed, decreasing its manufacturing base, using covert operations to blow up its gas reserves, gas supplies, and make it, all sorts of things that we're experiencing that destroyed the European economy. The Central African Republic decided to make Bitcoin legal tender, but then immediately got into shitcoinery and crypto shenanigans, and is now going back for its third round. Immediately, the president of Central African Republic went on to X and said, I think he got his inspiration from Trump launching his meme coin. He said, we're launching Central African Republic, CAR meme coin. This is no endorsement of the coin. Please do not mess around with these coins. But the meme coin was launched, immediately I came out and said, this one's not going to end well. They previously already said that they'll do Bitcoin as legal tender, but then they got into crypto shenanigans, and now they're getting into meme coins. It was announced by the president on X, and immediately that created a speculative frenzy that this was a deep fake. And so people were speculating whether it's real, a bit like when the Trump coin launched. And so the insiders got in, and then you end up with a massive rug pull amongst the whole thing. And so what did X do? X shut down the video, and then no one really knew what was going on. And CAR, the meme coin, crashed 97% within 72 hours. And then after that, they announced that they are trying to get the X account revived again. And it's your classic pump and dump, just like we have seen. People new to the market maybe not even remember things like Aurora coin, when we had the official Iceland coin that was a massive pump and dump in the very early days. We have seen these things time and time again, but those that don't know their history or haven't been following my channel or Bitcoin Hard Talk may think that they're inventing something new, but we've seen it time and time again. Rug pulls in the name of making people think that this is financial innovation. But we move to this free market. Everybody lives and learns, and hopefully they don't exit the market and they find that Bitcoin is the solution that they were looking for in the first place. Speaking of which, since the Trump token launch, the meme coin, it is now down approximately 70% upon the initial pump and dump. And his wife's token, Melania, is down 89% since the launch. And it was revealed that in the launch, the crypto lobby were gaining political brownie points by issuing loans to MoonPay, which was the issuer of the token that had a liquidity crisis, and Brad Garlinghouse from Ripple Labs and Galaxy Digital. They issued them a $160 million loans to MoonPay in order to solve that crisis over the weekend, so that they could sustain the Trump price surge. And then you can start to look back on chain around those initial injections around who knew it. But this took the price from approximately 200 million of the initial 10 to 20% of the supply. Remember, 80% of the supply wasn't released, and took it from 200 million to $10 billion market cap in the first 48 hours. Welcome to the meme coin pump and dump industry at the highest level, led by the president of the United States, who has an NFT collection, a meme coin for his wife, a stable coin to be launched soon, a DeFi project, a governance token for World Liberty Financial, a company that is going to be issuing a social platform that's integrated with finance, and also a Bitcoin ETF. We revealed last week how to figure out American policy so you can get ahead of it by simply predicting how Trump makes money. And that is the new model that we'll be following for the next 4 years in order to get one step ahead of everything. Now, speaking of which, Hester Pierce, who is a somebody that throughout the whole corrupt Operation Choke Point 2.0 was on the SEC chairperson, and was calling out the corruption of Gary Gensler and the opportunity wasted for America, and now has received the primary position in order to drive forward the mission of what crypto looks like as America wants to become the center of crypto capital. And she came out this week and said that meme coins are likely to fall outside of SEC. So that means that it is a free market and everyone can, the whole idea here is that anyone can do what they want, but we need to educate each other and call out the stuff because that's how it works. And so we need to become wiser to this stuff. But if people want to engage in that and ruin their reputation by trying to rug pull their fans, they end up with the full consequences of that. And fraud is still got fraud laws. So do you really need these additional protections or not? That's what's going to be battled out. And that is really one of the first things after stablecoin regulations are going to be figured out within the US. Is that the SEC that regulates that? Is it the OCC, kind of a subdivision regulator of the Federal Reserve and the proof of weapons network to control the dollar? Or is it going to be CFTC around commodities and the SEC around securities? That territorial battle is going to be resolved in the proof of weapons network as we integrate into more and more traditional financial products integrated with crypto. Now, remember, Bitcoin is proof of work. That means that it doesn't matter who owns it. It's not like proof of stake where you get a stake in it. And so therefore, you can still opt out and you can own your own Bitcoin in self-custody. You can remove counterparty risk. You can send it peer-to-peer with no government interference in terms of who you can send it to. You're accountable if you do things with that money. You still have to follow the law. And you can opt out of the Federal Reserve's inflation and escape debt slavery. Not financial advice, but everybody that has bought Bitcoin every month, regardless of price, done that for a full 4-year cycle, they've beaten every single asset class and all the inflation of the Federal Reserve, even in the ones that are the most affected, like the Zimbabwe proof of weapons network that drives inflation at levels like 900%. Even there, some people have been able to escape that through Bitcoin as well. So with the federal level, we talked about it on previous episodes of Bitcoin Hard Talk, that remember, pre-1913, there was a state banking system and a free banking system before the Federal Reserve took over the dollar and got the government into 36, 37, almost $40 trillion approaching of debt in order to fund all the wars. There was a resistance from the state banking system. But now there are 22 state bank bills that are basically states that are building and looking to implement bills in order to build their Bitcoin strategic reserves. And Basically, it means that your state can have a weapon and return if it chooses over time. When we have this battle between Treasury and Federal Reserve, or the Trump administration, I think it's all coming, that the states can protect themselves as well. In fact, one of the states, Wisconsin, their investment sovereign wealth fund has actually disclosed that they now have $321 million of a Bitcoin ETF holding. Now, if you want to go all out like Bekele, then you can own it in self-custody, have a multi-signature MPC structure. Maybe you can use BitGo, or you can use various other companies. And then the state can have a secure structure, publish the wallet address, and then you can make a policy that goes beyond saying we will not sell it. We will use it in order to build backing and reserves. And you can follow the address and see that the state is not selling its Bitcoin. Now, states can eventually get there. Initially, they're doing it through Bitcoin ETFs, but eventually the operations and even some of those ETFs are applying for in-kind redemption, where you could take your Bitcoin ETF, you could convert it for real Bitcoin rather than paper Bitcoin, and then you could do this strategy moving forward as the environment evolves slowly but surely. And all countries, all states, all companies, and certainly all individuals can do that. At the same time, they're deciding in America, as a result of this 100-day sprint to get America into the crypto central or the crypto capital of the world, they've got 3 different stablecoin bills that are all being processed and looked at right now. Obviously, the Fed wants to get a look in because this is a speculative attack potential on fractional reserve banking, and the shareholders of the Federal Reserve, which are the private banks that have a bank first policy, which is a globalist institution, which leads me to believe that it's not an America first policy, because they are diversified across all the different regions. And just like the Bank of England, after they indebted the UK government, they just dumped England and turned it into a conduit for big pharma, the military industrial complex, and the banking lobby over time. This could happen with the Federal Reserve in America, and the more Bitcoin strategic reserves, they can use that and later be able to do what JFK did just before he was assassinated, where essentially JFK at Treasury issued $4 trillion, which were convertible into silver as a resistance movement against the Federal Reserve System, just as Abraham Lincoln did with the greenback before money was digitized. And so these opportunities exist. So they're going straight into stablecoin regulations. And is it possible that the Trump administration, launching through World Liberty Financial his own stablecoin, that he would like to be the center of the US financial system through his family and his legacy as we enter into this battle? Possible, early days, but stablecoin regulations are the next ones to go through. The next thing that they're going to be looking at after stablecoin regulations within the US is market structure. That's basically who's going to regulate who. Is the Fed through the OCC going to be able to get their grubby mitts on stablecoins? Because they're saying we don't want to launch a central bank digital currency, which essentially says instead you can do stablecoins and hands it over to the technocrats. I'll go more about that in the geopolitical section as well. But who regulates who? Is it a security? Is it a money market fund because it's backed by treasuries and it's got a fund manager? We shall see. Anyway, all of that is going to be determined next after the stablecoin regulations. In true crypto capital style, all of the TradFi players within America are now going full YOLO into shitcoinery in the shitcoin casino. There has been applications for XRP ETFs. There have been applications for Dogecoin ETFs. There have been applications for Solana Sol ETFs. There have been applications for Cardano ADA ETFs. And there have been applications to convert the ETH ETFs into ETH staking. Remember what I said about that one. There is going to be a two-tiered market within Ethereum. Those that are using it in self-custody through for DeFi, and those that are going to be holding it through an ETF. And once they start staking, they get essentially a voting right in the governance of the network, unlike Bitcoin, and they can use that in order to build an alternative financial system using their influence in kind of a creature from Jekyll Island hybrid model based upon ETH staking. Once the ETFs are able to get you to put your ETH with them, and then they can stake it for you, pass it on, but they get a control in the governance next. I will be watching that one with great interest, as well as BlackRock saying that they're looking to build a tokenized exchange on top of Ethereum. We're seeing a lot of movement in the layer 2 there. And on the news, there was a bit of a reversal in the ETH price relative to Bitcoin after having a shambles of a performance over the last few years, as we go into this crypto-friendly environment within America that needs a few months in order to catch up, but lots and lots of ETFs, and the battle for control over the crypto market in those lower liquid non-proof of work tokens received as well. Speaking of that, at Bank to the Future, when people want to do things like stake ETH and then convert their ETH stake into Bitcoin, we want to make sure that that doesn't create taxable events through converting fiat into a share that then is backed by a token. And then you go to Lido, and Lido is converting one token to another token, and then you create a taxable event. At Bank to the Future, with our products, we always did it. It's not open to US because it's mainly focused on the non-US market, because we sold our broker dealers to Coinbase so that we could persist in putting together innovation in the right way rather than capture. We had it where you basically rent a validator. You can receive the stake through staking ETH, and then you can convert it into Bitcoin, but you don't necessarily, not tax advice, end up converting that token for another security and therefore create a taxable event. You're simply renting validators so that you can do some of the different types of strategies and build income when you're building your Bitcoin strategy as well. Anyway, at Bank to the Future, a little bit of a plug. We received our EU license in Poland so that we can work with European residents as that regulatory environment goes through, and we can keep the same ethos. And we this week were finally, after a year at Bank to the Future, approved as a financial promotion in the UK, which allows us to open up to UK investors again for our crypto asset services. So if anyone wants to do ETH staking the right way with a Bitcoin ethos, then feel free to create your account at Bank to the Future as well. And you can make sure that you later this year will be, for those of you that stake with us, for example, we'll be launching our Bitcoin Wealth Builder program. And you can get that actually complimentary to anybody that is using us as a customer. Check out when you create an account, on the very first page, there's a section there where you can track your Bitcoin wealth building journey and go through the different phases of sorting out the tax or sorting out the inheritance structure, but getting started. Anyway, enough plugging there. What else did we get in the crypto market? Well, Fed Chair Jerome Powell, he was coming out and he was testifying. I think it was a Senate hearing. Maybe I've got the terminology right. But anyway, he was doing those one big loads of questioning. And the Federal Reserve announced or answered one of those questions, stating that it will never create a central bank digital currency. What does that imply to me? Well, it implies to me, remember, there are quasi-opposites. There is, you hand the industry over to the central bank, which is in time of a financial crisis, the central bank can have a tool which can essentially say, we'll let the banks go bust. And you can download this app and you can have your bank deposit can be swapped for a CBDC. That is one mechanism. Or it could say, we'll hand over the model to the technocrats, which is essentially the stablecoin issues, like the PayPal mafia. Like PayPal has its own stablecoin. It looks like Tether is working with Cantors in order to be a part of the ecosystem. Now it's the 18th largest lender to the US government through its stablecoin. And as I said, Trump is getting ready to launch one as well through World Liberty Financial. And so watch for the technocrats to have this battle between stablecoins and central bank digital currencies. And it looks like Jerome Powell said we will not be launching a CBDC. So that's the initial indication, which either means it goes in the stablecoin direction, which is non-fractional reserve banking and an attack on the Federal Reserve System, or will in the future a CBDC be repackaged in some other form where rather than having a CBDC, the shareholders of the Federal Reserve, like JP Morgan and other European banks, they launch their own stablecoin. And then it is the Federal Reserve policy through the regulations they set up at the OCC can do a stablecoin first policy where essentially the banks get to control them. Watch these battles. And remember, you can always peacefully opt out of the proof of weapons network by owning Bitcoin, converting your fiat currency into Bitcoin, and holding enough of your fiat currency in a stable coin so that at least you don't get the fractional reserve exposure, you get non-fractional reserve exposure and more of a market pricing, as we have seen with other stable coins. But of course, we will always make sure that I'm giving you the updates as we transition. The Department of Government Efficiency, through Elon Musk, part of the PayPal mafia, doing some awesome work in terms of exposing the system. We'll cover more on the macro side and the geopolitical side. But he started to give some indications that Doge, which is now a growing institution, getting some pushback from the judges at the moment, but they would like to transition to a system where all transactions at the government level start to move onto a blockchain, which is stablecoin. After stablecoin regulations, you can see how this is all shaping up as well. And as I said, remember, Trump is launching his own stablecoin. So is Trump right now setting his family up to become and battle against the Fed or the banks into the future? Remember last time when there was the attack on Trump in order to replace him with the Biden administration, and they used lawfare in order to come after him, and they used all sorts of shenanigans. One of them was what they did to WikiLeaks. They just debanked him, and so all of the banks weren't able to service. So maybe Trump remembers that, and maybe this is the whole world liberty DeFi play as we enter into America being the shitcoin casino of the world. Anyway, we also got an admission from Jerome Powell that there was shenanigans played. Remember, I told you about Nick Carter's revelations around Operation Choke Point 2.0 and how it was used in order to take out the crypto-friendly banks. The Fed said, we'll investigate it. Clearly, something happened. So now the architects of Operation Choke Point 2.0 want to look into themselves, which is kind of what we're seeing around the people that have been appointed, and we'll cover this more in the macro section, to reveal the JFK files and all the different files, the Epstein files, with a same type of person that may be connected to Mossad. So unlikely to reveal themselves. Now the Federal Reserve is investigating themselves for Operation Choke Point 2.0, but there was an admission that there were shenanigans happening as well. The Department of Government Efficiency called for an audit of the Pentagon and an audit of the Fed. Now, this one, Ron Paul, who did more for exposing the Federal Reserve, that launched the original End the Fed campaign, spent his whole life, a man of integrity, fighting against the corruption all the time. One of the very first people to reveal that Congress was funding, Al-Qaeda and various other networks, revealed it in Congress, exposed the whole thing. Then later, WikiLeaks exposed the whole thing after the financial blockade. And now USAID is revealing it as well. Now that we've got all these revelations, there was one man that stayed absolutely on top of the whole thing and has been on the right side of history. And I really want to see the audit the Fed, which was the compromise after End the Fed, to be implemented while Ron Paul is still with us. And his family, Rand Paul, is a part of the Congress as well. I would really love to see him see the audit the Fed in his lifetime, a man of integrity. I do believe that would be the ultimate justice. And I hope this actually happens, because we saw what happens? You can start with an audit. You can then lead to a revelation of corruption, which can then lead to the shutting down as an alternative structure exists. And that's exactly what we saw with USAID. And I'm going to be covering more of that in the macro section today. Anyway, we are seeing the new model. Anyway, just to make sure you are there. Now, I am loving everything I'm seeing. But just remember, be ahead of everything. We are replacing one evil with another evil because the system got busted. At Bitcoin Hard Talk, we've been covering this all along. We've been revealing that all wars are deep state wars funded by the Federal Reserve through the International Monetary Fund, which is a mafia racketeering organization to get debt slavery around the world. And intelligence don't work for the national security interests. They work for corporate interest. And then that money gets printed and used in order to bribe Congress. And it uses NGOs in order to siphon money. They say that we're doing it in the name of charity, which goes to the people where those charities are being used to topple governments, implementing covert regime change, all the ones that were declassified by the CIA during the Cold War that are now being used in the fake war on terror in order to prop up the dollar and create constructs like the Petrodollar and the Euro dollar that we've covered many times on Bitcoin Hard Talk. Well, USAID got exposed and it is now revealing in plain sight because too many people understood the gig. Now, the average person doesn't really understand it. They still think that there's these, that they're in a fight for their survival and these crazy people. They don't realize that their taxpayer money is being used in order to create these fake groups. They co-opt the bosses, and then they go into these, terrorist training camps in order to create a narrative. And then they buy the media. So the BBC, it was exposed, completely bought by USAID. The entire Ukrainian media, completely bought by USAID. And Fox News, CNN, we know how they make their money now. It is through the money printing of the Fed that then goes to USAID. The largest recipients of USAID are countries like Israel and Egypt and Jordan. And then they have their, we're replacing democracy with dictators. And then you have the monarchs in there, and they're easy to bribe through these schemes. And then they have a Fed first policy because then the IMF will topple their currency in a currency war and destroy that country, which is why we created Bitcoin in the first place as a peaceful resistance against it. Well, all the corruption is being exposed because WikiLeaks exposed it. Julian Assange is now free. The financial system tried to take down WikiLeaks when he exposed it. Instead, there was all of Trump using like the Hillary Clinton emails when all the emails were released. And that just exposed that, that administration, when they were blackmailed under the Clinton administration, read Whitney Webb's book that showed that Epstein was a Mossad operation that blackmailed US presidents in order to change their policy, remove all peace like Oslo Accords, make sure that it wasn't happening, use the media in order to think that it's these crazy terrorist groups that they're funding, and just trick the whole people. The whole damn operation is now in black and white, exposed through AI, through Doge. Why? Because they're moving to a new system. And the new system is radical transparency so that all of that data can be used in order to build artificial intelligence, which feeds back into the data, like that is funding, example, genocide as a service and occupation as a service in Palestine right now that requires more and more data. And that's the model that we are shifting to. Anyway, what is the model? I'll go through a bit more now that we've covered that as well. Well, the model is expose it, shut it down, and then get radical transparency that leads to all of the data going through X, going through these artificial intelligence algorithms, and then that can be used for stablecoin monetary policy by those that control the data and are able to implement, a attack on the Federal Reserve System, but replace one evil with another evil, which is the powers that control the stablecoin systems as we transition to this data-driven model. And of course, X at the same time as being able to get access to all this data through Doge, announced that X is now becoming a financial institution by partnering with Visa and launching the payment system, which requires vast amounts of data in order to transition to this stablecoin technocracy. And of course, use Stargate, which is the Federal Reserve printed money used to invest $500 billion into making sure that all these data centers through ex-CIA intelligence operations, like Larry Summers. When that bid went to, instead of going to XAI because it was too blatant, it went to OpenAI and Sam Altman. And so we saw a bid from Elon Musk to bid for ChatGPT. Why? Because DeepSeek came out and said, we disrupt your model, which had an attack on NVIDIA's share price and Microsoft's share price. And remember, Elon comes from a globalist type of environment that is pushing forward this environment because Tesla works with EVs in China as well, where the parts come from, as well as America. But by being able to release DeepSeek, you then get an attack upon it where ChatGPT needs the money when you follow the money. Basically a group led by Elon Musk said, if you don't not turn, if you keep, we're going to bid for your company, 97.4 billion. And remember, by working with the Trump administration, Elon's wealth went up like over 250 billion. He spent 150 billion on the campaign, but his wealth went up significantly. But now he is able to put together a group, bid on OpenAI, so who's got the Stargate contract, and then be able to buy it, and saying that basically the world's largest AI company. But he said, I will remove my bid if and only if Sam Altman sticks to his original philosophy that this stays a not-for-profit company. So he has hook, lined, and sinkered OpenAI that has got the government contract. Basically, Sam Altman now needs to raise approximately 100 billion fast in order to remain a for-profit when he wanted to convert the not-for-profit. And Elon has got his revenge. Now, historically, where did OpenAI get that money from? SoftBank. SoftBank is the Japanese proof of weapons network that is able to use the Japan carry trade, which essentially is a Fed-first bank that created massive inflation within Japan in order to be able to leverage that, borrow that, get the cheap rates, and then invest in things like the Operation Stargate as well. But they don't have the money. They're maxed out because they invested in Stargate. So hook, line, and sinker, checkmate. Sam Altman doesn't have their normal source of funding, and Elon Musk can gobble up the thing and force the policy on it. It either becomes open into Tesla, not X, OpenAI, which is a private company. Basically, you can use those type of financial weapons of mass destruction in order to checkmate your competition. And that is exactly what we are watching. And now remember, they've got the contract that's whipping through all of this data, and we can essentially move into this AI honeypot of data, and then the model can be wash, rinse, repeat. So what do you do if you're Elon? You say, I'll support all the different governments. Hey, Germany, here's the person that will transition. And guess what, Europe? The CIA blew up Nord Stream pipeline, destroyed your manufacturing base. We'll use some Trump tariffs in order to further destroy your economy. And at the same time, we'll ask you to spend more with us. And we can use the fact that USAID was funding all these organizations that led to the open border policy. We can blame it on the Democrats, saying it's Democrat corruption, nothing to do with us, that led to the environment that's leading to everybody questioning what the hell is happening to this invasion. And then you can weaponize all the religious wars and the nationalist wars And you can use that in order to say, now you need Mega. And what is Mega going to do? Mega's going to copy the MAGA model and say, you need Doge, and we're going to be begging for Doge to expose our corrupt governments and say, please, we'll give all the AI data in the name of Mega, and you can have all the European data, and you can have the UK data. And so now he is choosing the candidates that will fulfill that vision for him and making people happy, because, of course, he's exposing the corruption of the proof of weapons network as we transition from one evil to another evil. And speaking of which, we had MIGA, Make India Great Again, so that we can have all of that data. And, of course, the different types of negotiations saying that as America retreats, India needs to buy more of our gas as well. And India needs to buy more of our oil. So we're creating these global honeypots of data. What do they need in order to achieve it? Well, they need the rare earth minerals, and they need the gas that is providing all the electricity in these ginormous data centers as we enter into this global war for who's going to control all of the data. Why do you need those rare earth minerals? Well, China has them because you need semiconductor chips. Semiconductor chips is how you power all of this artificial intelligence. And then you need a manufacturing base in order to build all of this big data so that you have the servers controlled in private companies. And China essentially has their model, which is moving towards open source, interestingly. And you have Meta, which is going open source, but consumers get a better model. But what's happening in the middle? Well, these companies like Palantir and various other ones, they have their kind of Israel first type of people like Peter Thiel through Palantir, who is building AI warfare and AI weapons that is deciding how to execute a genocide with machines in Palestine, which is the beta test, as they sell it to other regimes, like how they used to sell to apartheid South Africa. And suddenly we get an announcement that anything that South Africa is doing, America cares about it. When the reality is they're pulling the money away from South Africa because USAID, they're exposing it, and they're saying, South Africa, we can't afford it anymore. We're in retreat, as I covered last week as well. But in the middle of that, you've got Israel that's taking all of that data and then selling it to China because they are in the middle of both and work with both as well. And so it is one big honeypot data play, which is why we're getting more and more freedom of speech right now, and why we are saying we love the fact that you're revealing the corruption, because now they feel safe. The gig is up. The scam is over. But we need to be vigilant and get ahead, as I always make sure you are one step ahead. So with that in mind, now that we understand how this stablecoin, CBDC, Bitcoin world, make sure that you have the peaceful resistance, because in the end, we need it to be exactly as we did with Bitcoin, fight back against the Fed with peaceful proof of work by allowing people to beat inflation, allowing people to own their own data, allowing people to send it without permission. That's what we need to do with AI into the future. And there is a big movement in our industry to try and make open source, decentralized artificial intelligence that can essentially learn from these big honeypots of data. And we can do what we did to Bitcoin, create peaceful resistance moving forward as the Federal Reserve and the central banking cabal fight over CBDCs with the technocrats that fight over stable coins. And we have these currency wars, and we can opt out with the currency that everybody wants and everybody needs, which is Bitcoin proof of work, because it's apolitical, no counterparty risk, peer-to-peer transactions that allow you to beat the price manipulation of the debt-based slavery proof of weapons network called the dollar, and the worst iterations of that, the shit coins like the pound, the euro, and all of the sub ones that are members of the Bank for International Settlements in debt slavery through the International Monetary Fund, where they can just wipe out your wealth and say, we're going to devalue that currency and we're going to shut down, like they did with the Lebanese banking system in 2019, to steal everybody's wealth in these hyper-dollarized economies and central banks that operate on these derivative network of shitcoinery based upon the US dollar proof of weapons network. Right, now I'm going to be going into the second half. If you're watching the clip video, we're going to be moving over to part 2, where I'll tie this all together, go deeper into the USAID stuff, the bigger macro strategies that we're experiencing right now. Do me a favor. If you've enjoyed this, please do like, please do share. I hope you agree with me that everything I'm saying, the algorithms hate. So I rely upon you. Help me get to 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. Put some comments below. I read them all. And share this with as many people as possible, because here is the thing. Bitcoin is a resistance that benefits from as many people joining us. We need more and more people to own Bitcoin. We need them to understand why, and we need them to be protected as we transition to a world of Bitcoin AI and CBDC. So let's move into part 2 this week in macro. Like, share, subscribe. Okay, what happened this week in macro? Right. So there was basically a big drawdown in people that were trying to get gold out of the Bank of England, those that were custodying gold with the Bank of England, that also has these sub-networks and derivatives of paper version of gold, which many people believe that the paper version is not backed by gold, because that was a scam of the proof of weapons network that got the fractional reserve system legalized in order to have a nice scheme with governments where you could enslave them and indebt them, and then that could be used in order to invest in war, so that you could then take your companies and make sure their share price increased through war, death, and destruction. That was the Bank of England model. And now there is an exodus of gold away from the Bank of England. And people are questioning, are the gold reserves there? So those that were trying to get their gold out were explaining, and I won't go too deep into this, but there was a 6-week delay being told to them in order to receive their gold. Wouldn't it be great if there was an asset class where you could see on chain, it was completely auditable, and you didn't need a counterparty in order to prove those reserves? Well, we created a digital version of that called Bitcoin. But we're seeing some of the challenges with the legacy system, gold, which is a hedge against Bitcoin failure. I still believe in physicality under set circumstance, but we are seeing the weakness of that as well. 6-week delay. Remember, during the lockdowns, people could not get their physical gold when they were requesting it, because all the systems broke down, and suddenly it's all in Singapore, it's all in London, it's all in Texas, it's all in Switzerland, and you don't know whether it's there or not. But I think you can safely say that if they need 6 weeks in order to give you that gold, they're probably scrambling to buy it. And if the price of gold is going to new all-time highs as it approaches almost $3,000 now, you can bet your bottom dollar that the Bank of England is empty. And do we get to audit the Fed and follow the same model that we got with USAID, which is expose the corruption, audit it, and shut this shit down? Well, it's a bigger mission, but we've already proven the model. But they're probably waiting for the stablecoin regulations and an alternative system, all to come, I believe, in the Trump administration. So gold starts to hit a new all-time high. And gold is being repatriated away from the European Union over to the US. And of course, those at BRICS have been accumulating it all along with China, Russia, various other jurisdictions that need apolitically neutral. Anyone that has been sanctioned needs their Bitcoin, their gold stacks. And I believe that they're going to be repurposing their energy towards Bitcoin. And many people are doing that anyway. You find out that the emperor has no clothes, and the power structures are all built upon a web of lives, a web of debt. And eventually, as the tide goes down, you realize they're completely naked and have no power. And that is what Bitcoin gives to us. And so what is happening in the macro environment? Essentially, the US, as I explained last week in Bitcoin Hard Talk, is moving towards a deliberate policy to weaken the dollar, which means that we need to say that we are strong right now as we move to nationalism under the MAGA movement, because we want to peacefully retract, weaken the dollar so that we can build our manufacturing base, because we are no longer a global power. Now that China has won that side of the region, BRICS has reunified around a global south, and the region within the Middle East can't be toppled and destabled by these covert operations, because USAID has revealed the whole scam. And so we now have to engage in diplomacy and negotiate and accept that there will be a power structure within Europe, the Middle East, and BRICS around the global south, centered around China, as America becomes America first, unwinds the proof of weapons network, and hopefully ends the Fed, or at least builds the tools to end the Fed. And you can reverse all of the damage that was done, that was created this whole Ponzi scheme in the first place. So America has a ginormous budget deficit. And so by implementing tariffs, it is moving towards, like a company that's in bankruptcy, eliminating all the costs, implementing focus on increasing revenue and decreasing the deficit. But decreasing the deficit cannot coincide, has to coincide with a massive contraction in GDP, a recession and depression, unless you get monetary reform, which is why I think the crypto capital of the world, Bitcoin strategic reserves, is essential in order to manage that peaceful transition, as probably the BRICS corridor recognize that you can use Bitcoin as well. And the whole world starts to recognize that, and you can front run through these macro trends that we are experiencing. So I am certain right now that this is a way of recognizing that America is now a superpower region rather than global police for the world. And that is why we are negotiating with BRICS and Russia right now, recognizing that the proxy war didn't win. America went broke. The middle class got wiped out. The suicide rates are higher than ever. People went crazy with these woke regimes. It went to a populist movement to the right. We had this immigration, deep state initiatives that are driving people further and further apart, that led to more and more wealth inequality. And then that export and blew up the entire world. There is no middle class. And now you need to retreat and recognize that the dollar is absolutely predatory to the world unless we restructure it, go America first, and recognize that before we go to World War III, we are a regional power, and there are multiple regional powers around the world, and we can no longer police. So we need USAID, expose it for what it is as we retreat. And then there are forces that want to drive America into World War III, as we are seeing, with the desire to try and get America to occupy Gaza so that they can trigger another war and force a regime change in Iran, another forever war that will be worse and worse. We'll go through that in the geopolitical section, but let's stick to the macro trends in order to prop up the petrodollar. This is a retreat away from the petrodollar by focusing on America having its own energy, its own oil, its own rare earths, its own semiconductor manufacturing base. Tariffs is the way to do it without you looking like you're retreating and you're no longer a superpower, which is what would have happened if you carried on to fight Russia. And if you turn this into a rapid escalation, the whole thing would have been a disaster for everybody. So tariffs is focusing on bringing in new income and giving the Trump administration negotiation power so that it can drive more export, so that it can rebuild its manufacturing base. But there is a price to that, and that is rampant inflation. And that's why I believe that it has to be mixed with a monetary reform in order to transition out of it peacefully. But the Fed ain't going to give up power until America's destroyed. And then they go, which is why why you got to recognize that the Fed is a globalist, not an America first. You know, BlackRock is a globalist, not America first. The banks are globalists, not America first. And so if you want an America first monetary policy, you need the reforms, which is what we are going through in this interesting time in the macro environment. So you will need a monetary reform as the world moves to world reserve currencies not being one homogenous power that uses terrorism and covert weaponry in order to destroy, kill, and massacre people, as it happened in the post-World War II era, using organizations like USAID and many of the others. Don't forget, no one's talking about the National Endowment of Democracy, NED. Go have a look at that institution. That's the one that makes you think you're exporting democracy when you're replacing any shot of democracy with dictators through colored revolutions, through funding terrorism, and through overthrowing and toppling in order to have violence that props up the world reserve currency and gets that massive deficit that's imploding on itself right now. So what is the extent of it in the macro side? So at the moment, America is running this year or last year a $2.1 trillion deficit. So to get that back to a surplus, you got to find $2.1 trillion of additional revenue, which is essentially a contraction of the economy because the dollar is debt. Debt is dollar, which is why world reserve currency requires deficit spending, government debt, corporate debt, and individual debt propped up by real estate. So to balance that budget, it would require cutting debt of $2 trillion in spending. Now, remember, the $250 trillion of liabilities on top of the $37 trillion of debt is all war, military-industrial complex, interest on debt, Medicare, Social Security. So only through pension reform can you achieve that goal, which means potentially defaulting and moving to a new model, hence the Bitcoin strategic reserves and creative structuring that can happen in America as we go through this correction in GDP that are required, because without it, it would be like the global financial crisis. Again, those types of numbers. So this is what we are experiencing right now. This is why people need to protect themselves with Bitcoin and not fall for the tricks of crashing Bitcoin, making you sell your Bitcoin to those that are buying it, which are the hedge funds, which are manipulating the price short term. Okay. Right. So in these tariff wars, we haven't had any in Mexico yet. We just had a reciprocal agreement. So we haven't had any in Mexico. Those are your neighbors for the nationalist policy in order to be the regional power. But the real one is on China, because it is about trying to weaken China. You lost the last trade war, and that is what drove more and more people from the global south into working with China. The Belt and Road Initiative didn't topple any governments. And so while they are lending people, they have a business model that's different to America. They're investing in growing the economy rather than controlling the government, regardless of their economic model, which is driving more people to want to go to China. And so if you are South Africa and you're being targeted by the proof of weapons network, and they're pretending that your internal issues are things that they're trying to solve, you need to retreat and you need to say, well, where am I going to get that money from now? I'm going to go with the country that's going to rebuild my economy rather than exploit my economy and use blood diamonds and various other things, which are Israel policies to prop up De Beers and various other things, as was revealed in those movies, if you haven't watched them. Well, anyway, China's saying it's going to reverse with a 15% tariff, and we're going to enter into trade wars. But before doing that, it went into a complaint to the World Trade Organization at the same time as America retreating from these organizations. And so that gets to lead to more exposure of corruption. So we're getting this mass exposure of corruption in order to peacefully be able to retreat. So America can say, we are still powerful, and we get to move to this AI type of world where everyone focuses on energy and electric vehicles and everything that essentially China and America are focusing on right now, with two different models. One with a state banking system, the other with a Federal Reserve proof of weapons network that transfers all the wealth over to the shareholders of the Federal Reserve and the recipients of lobby money like the military industrial complex and big pharma. Anyway, So Trump decided the next stage is to impose this week a 25% tariff on, in England, we say aluminium. I don't live in England, but I'm still British. You say aluminum and steel imports. So that was the next target, which is a corporate level target rather than a country level. We will see the impact of that. The largest exporter of aluminium, I'll say, and steel to America is who? Canada. And so that impacts Canada. And we are still preparing for the reaction to the European Union, which is why we had all of these NATO battles next. And I hope and pray that this strategy is going to be used on NATO, because that is another USAID that is killing so many people in the eyes of pretending to, be a European first policy of not working with Russia that wanted to join NATO, and instead servicing the profits of America's military-industrial complex by expanding NATO to create aggression and then scam people and countries into spending more and more and more on America, which is driving the euro-dollar demand that was having all this inbound investment in order to prop up the dollar and its deficit that was causing more wealth inequality in America, and having the European Central Bank take over all those currencies to have a Fed-first policy and destroy the base of the European people. So what will happen in the tariff war with the European Union? I think it will drive people to, if we can expose the scam of the Ukrainian war, which was a NATO operation, in order to drive more profits and collateralize the land, and get those loans so that BlackRock and the globalist organizations can benefit from it and benefit from the killings, then the tariff war might drive a reunification between Europe and BRICS, so that we can have, Russia is this, BRICS corridor between China, Europe, and we can have the Middle Eastern bloc between America and China as well. So hopefully we're going to do that instead of World War III, but we shall see. But Europe is showing that they're a America first, which is what got them into this war in the first place. Instead, they should look at BRICS type of policy, look after yourself, and that could be exerted through tariff wars, and America could get to say, well, okay, then we'll have huge import taxes, which will bankrupt Europe. You can't say Europe spend more with us. You can't say Europe buy more gas from us. You can't say we'll charge more tariffs. We're going to be strengthening your currency relative to ours is one way of managing that transition. So we will see what happens within all these wars, these currency wars, and we'll keep doing that. But one thing I do agree with is reciprocal tariffs. So Trump announced his favorite policy. It was part of the last administration, reciprocal tariffs, which just simply says, if you tariff us, we'll tariff you. Who is impacted by that the most? India. 17% of the 17% tariffs charged by America by India. And so we had the meeting between Modi and Trump, and he was in there yesterday, and they were making their announcement. And of course, that follows up by these reciprocal tariffs leads to America being able to build its manufacturing base through export of gas and oil, by India buying more of it. And so you get, because of these reciprocal tariffs, so you get these executive orders, and India announced that it's going to be buying more natural gas, LNG, from US, as well as Russia, Saudi, and Iraq, which is where it was getting it all from. And remember, that was the scam. The scam was support India's economy by sanctioning Russia, blowing up the gas pipes through the CIA, and then just making it where the cheap oil goes to India. Russia sells it to India, and then India sells it to Europe and pays a lot more from it, until it then says, no, I'm going to buy it from America because it's slightly cheaper. And then Trump has a policy of trying to drive down the prices, which will support China, but it's a retreat economy and all the knock-on effects as well. So India currently buys all of its oil and gas from Russia, Saudi, and Iraq, but now it's going to be buying from America as a result of these tariffs, which is, again, the narrative that America is moving from a regional power with military bases in Asia to a regional power and bringing the troops home to avoid World War III and all the problems that could come from that. So at the same time, we got a little bit of a contradiction. You have to have some posturing, which is that Trump says anyone that does de-dollarization by supporting BRICS is going to get 100% tariffs. Who's a member of BRICS? India, China, Russia, South Africa, Iran, Egypt, Brazil, Ethiopia, and the many, many more applications that are happening right now. So again, posturing. And what is the posturing? It's we're strong. You're going to get 100% tariff, and you're going to start trading with China instead and BRICS, and you're going to start trading with each other so that we can weaken the dollar and more trades can happen outside of the dollar so that we can retreat and stop sending you money because we can't afford to send you any money. So we have to expose that the money is all corrupt, and we have to make you look corrupt and just focus on your things and pretend that we're the moral high ground people. That's what's happening on the macro environment right now. And so anyone that is working with BRICS is going to get that threat, which will lead to the aid being pulled and America being America first and regional power. So let me take a little bit of a water break. Now, which of the companies benefit from this new model? Well, of course, it's the AI warfare military industrial complex led by Palantir. Palantir, that is creating the technology for the IDF, that is committing genocide as a service, as a beta, that is also funding to all these regimes that America pretends it's exporting democracy to, that maintains that power through artificial intelligence. And who was behind that? The other co-founder of the CIA operations and technocrats that came from Larry Summers and Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, who is the beneficiary of Palantir, whose number one client is government, AI warfare. And so Peter Thiel, Larry Summers, is it Saunders or Summers? Why am I getting confused? Correct me in the comments which one I'm getting that wrong. And Elon Musk are going to be the technocrats that get the stablecoins, that work with World Liberty Financial, and it's going to be powered by a new proof of weapons network, which is where troops don't need to fight, machines fight, using the artificial intelligence. So now Palantir on the US stock market is trading at 60 times revenue, because all the corrupt funny money is buying the stock that's coming back in as you bribe the government, and you get this pushing of the war, and now you get a switch of the narrative. And who's going to be the benefit? Palantir, which does contracts with Israeli military industrial complex companies like CrowdCheck, the ones that led to the assassinations that we're no longer focusing on. Remember the assassinations in OpenAI that didn't make the mainstream because the organizations are paying the media in order to not cover those stories, as was shown in the USAID scandal. So the PayPal mafia are dominating Israel's technology, America's military industrial complex, and Israel is two-siding it with China and America. And then you've got these large globalist organizations like Palantir that sells to governments all around the world, as we have this slow transition. And of course, X is going to be the artificial intelligence platform that gets all the data. And there's no fighting it, because we'd rather have freedom of speech, take away our freedom of reach. And we'd rather have the exposure of the corruption that's gaslighting us and calling us all conspiracy theories, when anyone that follows the money knows that it's 100% true as well. So Palantir is beta testing all the AI warfare in the worst genocide that is going to be rebuilt by Trump. So we got the Trump narrative as well. Now, I don't believe that's going to happen, and I'll cover more about that in the geopolitics section. But essentially, there was a narrative that America will be pulling out of NATO, which I hope it does, because it's one big money laundering operation that controls media in order to make you think you're exporting democracy. But NATO said that everyone needs to, based upon America's principles, needs to move from those that were trying to get to 2% spending on Palantir and Boeing and all of the General Dynamic and all the military industrial complex stocks. They have to spend more and more of your GDP. So not only are you getting tariffs, not only are you getting covert regime change operations, not only are we implanting the person that's going to be using AI for mega and giving us all the European data, you're also going to be spending all of your money on our military industrial complex contractors. This is the pillaging of Europe if it continues down its America First policy. And so they said you need to go up to 5%. To put that in context, America would need to spend $1.4 trillion to meet that quota. That is more. There is $1 trillion of interest in debt. Remember where I said, if you want to tackle the deficit, it's war, it's interest, it's Medicare, it's Social Security. What is Medicare and Social Security? A racket for BlackRock and the service industry in Wall Street to charge you fees on your money. And now they're trying to charge you money on your Bitcoin with these ETFs as well to save the pension Ponzi scheme as these demographic warfares happen and we enter into this new retreating economy to a regional superpower. Anyway, they want Europe to go to 5% spend. That will bankrupt Europe. How do they justify it? Well, we created this proxy war between US and Russia, which WikiLeaks told us and leaked all the emails that this was a multi-decade operation and that Russia did want to join NATO and Europe was meant to align with Russia, but America wanted to engage in this financial terrorism involving the European Central Bank and a globalist agenda. But yeah, it won't happen. You can't have $1.4 trillion while trying to decrease your deficit. So hopefully that leads to the model of what we saw in USAID. America say we're not spending 1.4%. How are they going to justify it? Sorry, 1.4 trillion. How are they going to justify it? NATO is corrupt. So now let's end the war with Ukraine. We're going to negotiate getting all of the land. We're going to try and get some of our rare earths, even though Russia has already cornered that part. But we'll go now, and Putin, rather than demifying Putin, we're going to say actually he did want peace, and he's a power, and he's got more nukes than us. And so now you're seeing a change in narrative, which is why Trump was implanted in order to fulfill that agenda as well, which is why if you look back at previous episodes, I was able to tell you with precision exactly who was going to get elected, how it was going to happen, because I followed the money rather than following the narratives. Anyway, we know we are in that trade war when Trump starts looking at the tariffs within Europe, and that's going to be combined, I believe, with the peace negotiations between Russia, because Russia won and America got what it wanted. And unfortunately, the Ukrainians were the sacrificial lamb of the military industrial complex. And now we get the truth where, after the Biden administration saying to us, no, the IDF are targeting, they wouldn't blow up hospitals. They wouldn't dare target citizens. They wouldn't kill people. They're after it's just human shields. And now Trump tells the truth, that there's a humanitarian crisis, the whole thing's demolished. And now he starts to tell the truth that many Ukrainians have been killed as a result of this. And Trump wanted, and Putin wanted peace all along. And then they do USAID, which tells us how the media was spent as well. Anyway, this is bankrupting euro in order to protect the dollar. And our European politicians may be too dumb, because who do they get paid by? The Israeli lobby, the European Central Bank, the military industrial complex, the bank lobby, the big pharma lobby, which is why no one's focusing on Europeans, and all the money goes back into the euro dollar system. Okay. So as a result of that, there was an announcement that CPI, which is the measure of inflation that doesn't discount for the fact that the dollar is strengthening, so people feel broke and it feels like inflation's okay. And remember, this is cumulative upon a price that nobody could afford anyway, but you've now got 3% inflation at the same time as you cutting rates prior to the Trump administration in order to have the perfect setup of Operation Choke Point 2.0 on Trump, where if Trump wants to come against the Fed can hike rates in order to, because it's got this inflationary environment, and it can fully justify it and can wipe out the banking system and transition to a CBDC or a stablecoin and have full power over as we get that battle, which is why the Bitcoin strategic reserves for Treasury become higher and more important as a national security thing. And so we now are saying that inflation needs to be 3%. And they cut rates, even though it's gone from 2.4%, cut rates. 2.6%, cut rates. 2.9%, hold rates. 3%, hold rates. So this is, systemic inflation that is expected into the system, and the Fed having the tool that it needs if it wants to wipe out the proof of weapons network and replace it with a CBDC, which it's saying that it won't, or it's got its globalist policy and it can go through a non-America first if it chooses, because who are its shareholders? The banks. And they meet every period. Okay. So this is why we're having a corresponding deflationary force, which is a push for artificial intelligence, which leads to unemployment, eventually, I think. But all roads lead to inflation with the exception of a few industries. So some people are telling you that tariffs aren't inflationary, which is an element of truth. You can offset it with a weakening currency and build your manufacturing base, which is the transition we'll experience. But then rate cuts can offset that as well. And replacing illegal immigration with legal immigration and immigration reform is inflationary. And make America healthy again. That's inflationary because healthy means more expensive food. Because because you're not poisoning everyone with chemicals again. Isolationism, inflationary. And remember, inflation is exported globally because America gets the lowest inflation with all the ones that are on the Bank for International Settlements and IMF proof of weapons network, with the exception of those outside the system like China and various other regions. So RFK was sworn in. RFK is going to take on the big pharma, look for the reaction in big pharma stocks, and we shall see what happens as a result of that. But at the same time, we now have the USAID model. Now, a pro-Zionist is going to be in charge of doing the exposures, just like we saw with USAID. And Mossad operations and CIA deep state operations like JFK, RFK, Martin Luther King, COVID, the bio wars, 9/11, the Epstein files, they're all going to be revealed apparently, and we know what's in them already. But at least we get the confirmation. I hope it goes the same as USAID, but can we really rely upon a pro-Zionist that may have a dual Israel first, America first mandate, as she has all her photos with Netanyahu and everything? Can we really rely on them to expose Mossad, just like we saw in Hollywood when they blamed JFK on the CIA rather than Mossad, even though it was a joint operation? Do we get more of the same? I think so. This is going to be saying this is all the Democrats. So I'm okay with that, but we need to stay one step ahead and follow the money and recognize that, because that is the key to not going down the World War III path. Because the World War III path involves America being tricked through fake war and terror 2.0 into the Middle East in order to occupy Gaza so it can escalate to a war with Iran, who has 100 million, a military industrial complex, a base with all those drones, and will lead to a massive forever war, ginormous escalation. And Iran has already signed an agreement with Russia a 20-year security agreement, and Russia is needed for China's oil supplies. And so you enter into the path that Israel could take us down rather than the policy of retreating if you don't get control of the fact that there is a massive pro-Zionist policy, and Israel first policy is not in line with America first policy, as I can read the trees. So remember to follow the money, not listen to the narrative. And so I hope, and I will keep reporting as these exposures happen so people can stay ahead and make sure they're protecting yourself. But you can always opt out with Bitcoin as well. And hopefully you have been doing that every month, as I've been asking people and sharing with people to do ever since I did my first video at the first Bitcoin conference in 2011 and published the first published book in the world to include Bitcoin. Remember, you can get all of that at BitcoinHardTalk membership portal for absolutely free. Head over to simondixon.com, hit the yellow button, and you can get a free login, and then we can make sure you're ahead of this. And if YouTube bans all our videos or X bans all our videos because they don't like our message, then at least you can get them through the membership portal as well. And help me get to 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. I need that blue check so that I can actually stop the censorship that's happening right now, as I've been shadow banned ever since I covered the more geopolitically controversial things. Anyway, so what are the key deflationary forces? Well, unemployment. And what's happening with Doge? Doge is going to do mass unemployment from the government, as it should, as it needs to do. Artificial intelligence is going to eventually lead to large numbers of unemployment. And if you can really increase the supply of oil and gas by working with Saudi Arabia, which is why that region becomes so important, then you can decrease the price of oil and gas. And that can be a deflationary force, but there's the side effect. The frackers, the oil companies, can't manufacture at that rate. So that destroys the internal American base of its own resources, and OPEC can. And so that's why there's a deal that becomes increasingly important to Saudi Arabia that we'll be covering more in the geopolitical section as well. And so tariffs, relationships, follow the money, don't follow the words. And essentially, this is America moving to a regional superpower rather than being a global hegemony with all these covert wars that prop up the dollar. Okay. So deflation through rising unemployment, and that kind of ties into the stablecoin narrative or the CBDC narrative we need to be aware of, because you can program universal basic income, negative interest rates, which will come after the monetary reform, which requires an attack on fractional reserve banking, and then the Fed, or a replacement of the Fed with a CBDC. Many different directions this can go, but reducing the government burden can only lead to more unemployment. Essentially, the only way to navigate this is to ditch the proof of weapons network, which leads to more peace. More peace leads to more power for other regions and other blocks, because the scam is revealed. And you can protect yourself with peaceful proof of work, which is Bitcoin. And any country that wants to protect themselves can front run the transition as more and more stack their Bitcoin anyway. What else did we get in the macro side? So Jerome Powell had the Senate hearing. Powell said that quantitative easing would only be used if in a situation where rates were 0% again. Okay, so that means he's saying you won't see quantitative easing, which means a new tool needs to be used if it is needed. And that was also combined with a narrative of no CBDC, which implies the AI technocratic stablecoin version instead, more favoring over to that model. We shall see, and we'll watch that battle. But by the public statements, no QE unless we go to a zero interest rate environment. The problem is that obviously the proof of weapons network makes houses unaffordable. That's the side effect, because the banks always prop the digital currency that they create into mortgages. Mortgages prop up the real estate market. And that makes people's wages are not increasing at the same way. It creates wealth inequality and no ability to get onto the property ladder, particularly for those that were born in the wrong side of the proof of weapons network, while the boomers benefit from it and the younger people don't. And so Trump wants to get rates down as a macro policy for a couple of reasons. He's got a massive real estate portfolio, and he wants to be able to show that he can take on the Fed by doing the 10-year Treasury rates down, because you need to refinance all of the government debt. So how do you get that deficit down? Remember, there is no way to pay off the government debt. You need to refinancing it. So a massive chunk of US debt is going to become due, and they roll it over in the Ponzi scheme by finding new buyers for that debt. How do you find new buyers for that debt? You pay a higher interest rate. How do you find new buyers? You have a stable coin that backs it if you want to pay a lower rate. So you can have a policy of lowering rate and backing your currency through stable coins that then can be used in order to buy those treasuries. But during the refinance, you need to get those interest rates down. So Trump is frantically trying to either get Jerome Powell to put rates down, or do it through other type of forces as well. And how much is there? There is $14 trillion worth of debt that needs to be refinanced within the next 3 years. This means that all current interest rate levels, at the current interest rate levels, which is approximately 5.25%, it would cost an additional $300 billion to service it if you refinanced at these rates, which is why Trump needs to get interest rates down, and he needs to do it fast. The LA crisis, which happens at the tail end, is another problem, because now it's getting harder to have insurance on housing. And so instead, because you can't insure it, the only people that can buy housing are people that can buy it outright. And so in LA, you can only buy a house outright because people don't want to insure anymore, which favors those that have cash flow, which means that, again, more wealth inequality, more problems as a result of that, which is making it harder to get rates down and achieve the refinancing that is needed. So interest payments out. So where can you save? War. How do you save in war? Expose the scheme for what it is, USAID exposure, and then you can retreat. And the cost is you have global powers in other regions, and we can move to peace in order to spend less on war. And that is why I think I'm following the money, and that's where I think we're moving to. But there is a competing force which wants war that we need to be aware of, that we'll cover in the geopolitical section. Another interesting thing is you can use real estate. So rather than having real estate, the young people can buy Bitcoin every month, and you can change your time preferences. So rather than buying real estate, you can save that money and you can buy Bitcoin. You can buy Bitcoin every month, and historically it has outperformed real estate. And if you outperform it, then you may be able to buy the real estate outright, as was the case for me when I started buying Bitcoin at $3 in 2011 and said a simple policy: I need more Bitcoin this month than the previous month, which means that I need to spend less than I earn and save the difference in Bitcoin, which means that I need to restructure some of my debt and make sure that I invest and save in Bitcoin first. And ever since I did that, I beat the hell out of the proof of weapons network. And so has everyone else that I shared that strategy with ever since. But anyway, you could rent and you could save in Bitcoin. And I'm not saying that will work, not financial advice, but as a young person, that strategy has worked as well. Now, what other announcements are we seeing? Now, remember, we got this whole announcement around America having a sovereign wealth fund. Again, that ties into the narrative. If you're decreasing the deficit, you'll have a contraction in GDP. So therefore, you need a monetary reform, which ties into needing a Bitcoin strategic reserve. These things are incredibly complex, which ties into the tariff narrative. And then you need partnerships with the countries that have all the sovereign wealth. And so Saudi Arabia announced that it's going to be investing $1.5 billion in artificial intelligence. And Trump's son-in-law, Kushner, has a deal that had all the investment from Saudi to invest in real estate in the Middle East, hence the announcement about Trump saying we're going to take over Gaza and I'm going to own it. It didn't say America's going to own it. It said America initially, says I'm going to own it. And so this narrative, I'll cover that more as well. But with US running a trade deficit, the desire for worldwide sovereign wealth funds invested in America will be needed to have a Bitcoin strategic reserve in America's own sovereign wealth fund. But where are the funds going to come from? So I covered a lot of this last week, but I wanted to go a little bit deeper into this week. So I looked at the largest sovereign wealth funds to understand how can this be done? Have we got any test case for a world reserve currency retreating? Well, we got the British Empire retreatment, but there was another power to hand it over to, which was America. America doesn't have another power to hand it over to. So this is unprecedented. And we've never had a fiat currency, which was created in 71 when America defaulted and said you can't convert the Federal Reserve proof of weapons network into gold. And instead, the Fed ended up with the gold rather than Treasury, which is why the audit comes through. And I hope we get to learn the truth. But which countries have successfully run surpluses? And maybe there is a two-tiered strategy, which leads me to the belief that Saudi is an important partner in everything moving forward. So let's have a look. So Norway, which is a large gas exporter, an oil exporter, they have the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, 1.74 trillion. It was funded all by oil and gas revenues and trade surpluses. China has the second largest, $1.35 trillion, and it was funded by them being an exporter and having trade surpluses, by having a weakened currency, which is the strategy America wants to follow, so that it can build its manufacturing base, and then it had a surplus, and therefore it can have a sovereign wealth fund. UAE, Abu Dhabi, has $1.1 trillion sovereign wealth fund. That's funded revenues and surplus. Kuwait has $969 billion, oil and gas surplus. Saudi Arabia has $925 billion. Singapore has $847 billion, and another one, which is $288 billion. But it had that through funding its surplus as well by becoming a global regional port that could charge tariffs on its geostrategically important location as America is transitioning to, hence Panama. And that was funded by a trade surplus. Who else? Qatar, $510 billion sovereign wealth fund. That's funded by natural gas exports. UAE Dubai, $360 billion, which is funded by, again, being a strategically important location and creating a tax-free environment that also had a pro-crypto policy that America is following right now. So where do I think the money for the very first country in the world that is retreating from world reserve currency, that is trying to transition into a monetary reform at the same time, that is building a sovereign wealth fund that has a ginormous trade deficit? It's the first we have ever seen that has a fiat currency with no convertibility into hard assets. I think Trump is doing a two-tiered economy, which is going to have a sovereign wealth fund with money from Saudi. And maybe the GCC, some of the other regions like UAE and Abu Dhabi. And so therefore, it needs its relationship with the GCC, the Gulf, the Gulf Corporation and State Cooperation, rather, more than it needs its relationship with Israel right now. And so that leads me to the tension between America first, Israel first, and the historic policy of funding the military-industrial complex by creating chaos in the Middle Eastern region so the GCC could never reunify, that now has all of these sovereign wealth funds that America wants. As it builds AI and they want to invest in that, and it wants to invest in China as well, as it can sit in the middle of the region, which is why MI5 and the Rothschild family did the Balfour Declaration, giving Palestine to the Zionists through Walt Rothschild in the first place to create a region of instability and create all the fake religious wars and everything else in between. So that need is no longer there, which leads me to be very hopeful, maybe deluded, but very hopeful. But is America Israel first, or is America Israel first right now? That's the relationship that we need to test, because that is what held up all this region. And I think the GCC that has all the money and sovereign wealth, and America that wants it in order to manage this transition into a surplus. And it's got Bitcoin and a crypto strategy. This is how I see it in the macro side all around right now. So I think this ties into having a solution to Iran and Israel, which is saying you can't be a nuke, but maybe you can join GCC. They got regime change. Remember, the helicopter fell. Israel was used to take out the leadership in the different proxies in Hezbollah and various other regions. And so maybe, just maybe, I could be deluded, but maybe, just maybe, Israel can be controlled by the GCC. We can have a two-state solution, and we can actually have real peace, because that model's dead, which is why I think it's very important that we get the revelations from JFK, 9/11, Epstein, so that the intelligence, Mossad, and CIA operations can be revealed to everyday Americans, just as they are discovering right now that ISIS was a Mossad operation and Al-Qaeda was a CIA operation. And that brings me to how to manage this transition into multipolarity from the macro side. So that's everything I've got for you on the macro side. We're now going to move over to part 3, where we tie all this together on the Bitcoin side and the macro side into the geopolitical side. And so I'm going to do me a favor. I need to get to 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell symbol, hit all, because YouTube ain't giving us anything until we get to 100,000. And we used to have growth. And suddenly, as soon as I started revealing all these things, they wouldn't show our content to anyone. So I completely rely upon you, and I'll publish to X and Rumble. Please subscribe to me, follow me on Rumble. I got a tiny little following. But if this gets wiped out because they don't like my content, I'm going to have to transition to Rumble, and also follow me on X, and also join the BitcoinHardTalk membership portal, because if all of that fails, I'm going to need a self-hosted environment. And I want to continue making sure this message gets to as many people as possible, no matter what happens with the algorithm. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick water break, and then we're going to move into the geopolitics section for this week in geopolitics. Okay, massive week on the geopolitical side, and the whole world, all eyes on Trump, as Trump is looking to unwind the effects of the Biden administration by his pro-Israel policy that was taking us to World War III. Now, I don't know, I don't pretend to know what's going on, but I do believe that there are two outcomes. One is absolute carnage, World War III. And another is peace like we've never seen before. And I'm going to choose to be deluded that we are moving towards an environment of peace. But I follow the money, and I don't like where Trump got his money from. So he has a battle. And I'm hoping that my understanding of Trump right now is that he goes wherever the money is, will lead us to his self-interest fighting against the self-interest of World War III that will destroy his wealth. And so I'm going off that presumption. But does that lead to him going the same way JFK went and Abraham Lincoln went? As I don't know. Look, I just know that there are two outcomes, and we're going to follow it all the way. And I will keep following the money and not being fooled by the narrative. So in the geopolitical section, with all the macro section, the Bitcoin section, all of these trends, the weakening, the retreat to America being a regional power rather than a global hegemony because the world's too complicated. I believe Trump's trying to wrap up the bows and hand over certain structures and focus on the regional power. So Trump said that he had a very good talk with the Russian president, Putin, over the phone. And people freak out because USAID took over the BBC. USAID took over the Ukrainian media. USAID was funding through the National Endowment of Democracy the coups that led to implanting Zelensky over Yanukovych, and led to the coup and the war that started in 2014 that the media told you started in 2022. And so now all of that is being revealed. There's like this whole thing of, but everyone told us we were standing up for democracy. I can't stand to believe that all of this was for the profits of the military industrial complex and our media lied to us. That is causing Stockholm syndrome for people that really don't want to face that their money was being used for evil. And it was creating wealth inequality and inflation that's no longer working for them. Because the dollar is blowing up on itself right now, which is why we need the reform globally. So Trump said Putin, wants to see people stop dying. Suddenly it's a very different narrative. Remember, in February 2022, when we switched from a death counter on the TV saying that we're evil grandma killers if we don't inject ourselves, to saying everybody needs to fight now and we don't really care about that one. We now only care about looking at Putin. And this has only just started because he's evil, evil, evil. Now, I have no doubt that governments are evil. I have no doubt that there are different models that lead to atrocities in freedom of speech. But my belief is that's not what America's trying to solve. America's justifying the profits of the proof of weapons network because we follow the money. We're not gullible idiots because we don't follow their narrative. They use that as an excuse for actually they want the opposite. They want people that they can negotiate with easily, which means the opposite of democracy. And a person's struggle against their country and their government should be internal. Because every time an external force pretends that they're helping, they end up funding regime change, which leads to countries like Libya, Syria, Sudan, which are absolutely destroyed, death and destruction, coups, competing colonial empires pretending that they're helping when they're just raping, pillaging, and their resources. It's an internal struggle, but the external help never is external help. It's about taking resources and making it worse for people. We must have learned that by now through every post-war conflict that the CIA and the deep state have used since post-World War II. And we don't even want to get in those. I'm not going to go. I've covered the history of those and how that set the Federal Reserve Proof of Weapons Network up in the first place in previous episodes. You can go to my blog on simondixon.com, look at the history of central banking, for example, and look at other different episodes if you want to really freak out. And go to Apple Podcasts as well and Spotify, and you can subscribe to my podcast. And that is a more censorship-resistant environment right now. And you can download it, listen to it in your own time while you're driving and with no extra time as well, because I know these things can get long. Okay, Putin came out this week and he confirms that he is going to meet in person with US President Trump to discuss ending the conflicts with Ukraine. Brilliant. And we were told that the evil thing, you should not speak with these people, that's evil. We were also told that you should arrest them immediately, but no longer you need to care about those things because Netanyahu also got the same crimes against humanity for the much, much worse civilian attacks that Netanyahu's been inflicting in Palestine. Much, much worse than what you're seeing with Putin, because they just want to take the narrative that they control and make you feel the justification that you want to feel. Disgusting, the whole thing. But anyway, Putin said, we are ready. Trump says he wants to, he expects to meet with Putin in Saudi Arabia. So I think all eyes are on Saudi Arabia for the reasons that I covered in the macro section, for the sovereign wealth fund, the transition to deficit to surplus, a retreat from world reserve currency as the dollar to regional power. And Saudi Arabia and the GCC is the regional power that doesn't want all of these covert destabilizations anymore. And they're set the conditions steadfast for the last 2 years. What is it? They said, Israel, you have to have a two-state solution. Now, we know that you get the fake ones. I'm not talking about the fake ones, where Epstein blackmailed, Clinton, as was, if you read the book, One Nation Under Blackmail, it goes through exactly how that happened. And then Clinton was pretending he was delivering peace, but allowing Israel to sabotage it, and then pushing the narrative that the Arabs don't want to do it. And all the narrative and the headache you see today with whenever you're debating these issues. Saudi has said there has to be a two-state solution. There has to be Palestinian self-determination. The whole world said that, but only America has been every year in United Nations veto voting against peace while pretending that they're negotiating peace. Obviously doing that for Israel because of their Israel first policy, because USAID is funding Israel and more other blackmail networks. And then all of that blackmail has happened to Congress, and the money's going back through organizations like AIPAC and other NGOs and military industrial complex and all the other ones, in order to make sure that you cannot rise in Congress unless you have a pro-Zionist policy as well. And so that's the reality of the current situation. That's what you're up against if you want to be honest and if you want to get to the truth. And by following the money, that's how we get to the truth. And without truth, there can be no peace. So you either continue in denial and tell me I'm a tinfoil hat person, or you get smarter and wise up that now is the time to do this. Anyway, so Saudi and the Gulf Cooperation, GCC, they hold all of the key to, I think, both of the conflicts ending. So they want to Trump, because this was a US proxy war, let's face, against Russia. Europe was essentially the bait to be destroyed so that it could push up the euro dollar. Now is the time for end to that because of all the reasons I've said already. So President Trump and Russian President Putin, they have agreed to start negotiations immediately. They will visit each other in each other's nations, and they will meet in Saudi Arabia next. Trump said immediately after that phone call was announced, the Moscow Stock Exchange pumped like crazy. So this implies that there is going to be an opening up. And if these negotiations lead to the end of sanctions, how do you get to the end of sanctions? Well, you say that Iran, you can't have a nuke, is what they want to do. But instead, we'll remove sanctions. We won't have a nuclear deal like last time. Instead, you just get an economy. And so rather than doing what Biden did, where he said, we'll give you $6 billion, but you'll have sanctions, and then you open up to inspection, instead, no money. America gets to save money so that they can work on their internal policy and monetary reform. They can pretend that they're doing it for some other reason, not because they're broke, and they still look strong. And then you can have Iran that is working with the GCC, which was the China plan. The China plan through BRICS was to normalize between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they started that. America can take credit for that. Maybe you can get some normalization. If you can get there, then you can say, Iran, stop funding the additional proxies, but we need a real two-state solution. How do we maintain it? Because traditionally, Israel would create carnage, and then we'd pretend that it's the crazy Iran. Instead, we could blame it all on that with the fake war on terror. Instead, we say, let's do it genuinely. Let's wrap it all up with Saudi. We get the investment we need. We get the AI investment. And we get a security deal with Saudi Arabia. We get to sell our proof of weapons network, prop it up at the same time as transitioning. And Saudi Arabia, the GCC, with Iran as an ally, get to actually work on peace. What a thing. And that requires a two-state solution and then the end of all the craziness. Hopefully. Again, deluded, as you may call it, but the other path is just too unthinkable, especially as the geopolitical environment has changed. If America was still working on propping up the dollar through war, death, and destruction, then I would say the second that we'll go through. But because it's not, I'm going to remain deluded in thinking that maybe, just maybe, this can be done. And that was reflected in the Moscow Stock Exchange Index ETFs as well. And we shall see. Some of the narrative we're getting from the Trump administration, well, you've got the crazy ones, which are still saying there's no such thing as West Bank, there's no such thing as Gaza, call it Judea and Samaria, and they want to fulfill the Messianic vision of returning the Messiah by allowing the Likud party in order to rebuild the temple and sacrifice the red heifer, which is the stated goal of half the Israeli government, which requires taking down Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that's why October the 7th was allowed to happen in the first place, so that they could weaponize. And that's why they had the Hannibal Directive of Israel killing its own people at the same time as Palestinians going in for the hostage swap. We're getting some of that narrative still being propped up, and USAID obviously funded the media to make you think that there were 40 beheaded babies and mass sexual violence, all revealed. Even the Israeli chief that did it has now said it happened, and people still want to deny it, saying that's rubbish. He went on Israel TV and said, we implemented the Hannibal Directive. Even one of the ladies, the first hostage to be released, said and blamed Netanyahu on national TV, blaming Netanyahu for the IDF firing and killing their own people. And they had the tanks and their Apache helicopters. It was all. Make sure you reveal the documentary Atrocity Inc. now that USAID has revealed exactly how it works. That's on my blog. You can get it there. It's a great documentary created by great journalism, fighting against the proof of weapon network, Grey Zone. Please watch it. Just look it up. Atrocity Inc. How October the 7th was weaponized in order to destroy Gaza. And remember, all the AI trends and Palantir were involved in all of it as well. Well, one of the people in the Trump administration, I think his name is Peter Hegseth. Maybe I got that wrong. Sorry if I got that wrong. I'm famous for getting these names wrong. He came out and said no more US funding for Ukraine and no more weapons for Ukraine. That led to a hissy fit in Europe that are doing the bidding of the ECB for NATO in order to do their Eurodollar strategy and their US first strategy, because they're all corrupt and rich rather than being European first. He also said what we knew all along, which was the end of the Cold War and all of the WikiLeaks documents that everyone knew. Go to my X. I published all of the WikiLeaks video where I went through all the documents that they knew that this would lead to the war if you can agitate Putin. And so, he basically is now telling the truth that Ukraine can't join NATO. He doesn't see it as realistic. Couldn't we have said that before all the death and destruction? Before the facade of paying for the media? I hope you're realizing what this is right now as we retreat and take that evil and exchange it for the next evil, which is our AI one. Anyway, Marco Rubio came out on the Trump administration. We cannot return to the pre-2014 borders. We cannot have Minsk Agreement 3.0. All of this was known. This revealed the 2014 CIA coup. And that's what led to more power to Russia. The same agreement. This has happened 2 times. Now it's happened for the 3rd time. You just weren't paying attention, so you got tricked into it. And now we get everything being revealed as well. It's the very first time that they've been completely honest about the war. They're saying that it cannot be Minsk Agreement 3.0. We never had that narrative before. That wasn't the USA aid-funded narrative that was fed to us. And they're saying that actually the real reason for this is that Russia's security must be considered in all negotiations. So the CIA implant Zelensky, who is allegedly, if you listen to Trump, who's telling maybe the truth, maybe exaggerated, that $350 billion has gone into the military industrial complex, corruption. Only a tiny amount of it made it to Ukraine. And the 100 billion that was rinsed through the ECB in Europe, and all the NATO shenanigans that happened with it. And Zelensky was the implant in order to achieve that corruption, who hasn't done election, that we're told is the hero through the media, that has no chance of being re-elected if it actually went to what we're meant to believe are democracies, needs to have the Ukrainians decide who's going to be the leader. Anyway, it said, Ukraine can't join NATO. And so he came out and said, if we can't join NATO, then we have to make Ukraine into NATO. And so that is building its own military base. But I just don't think Zelensky is going to survive it, because I believe that the unpopularity, while we're told in Europe he's the most popular ever, I think people have realized that the death and destruction is unbearable. And there have been far too many soldiers killed as a result of this. It's the most unethical thing that we're led to believe is our ethics. And for some Stockholm syndrome, we want to believe that because Putin is a dictator is why we did it. He may be. Leave that for their internal struggle, because you don't care about that when you don't have a strategic interest and you don't have the media telling you how you should feel. Hence, USAID exposure. So at the very same time, when the peace happening, we get the truth and the end of the gaslighting and a transition to this AI world as well. So the proof of weapons network and the strategy has been exposed. It didn't really hit the mainstream narrative, but hopefully you can follow the money, or you can use BitcoinHardTalk in order to get it. And you can cross-reference it on WikiLeaks and now the official Doge website that will reveal all this stuff as well. And you can start to put it together and realize, boy, have I been lied to. And that's why there's record low trust. The Fed prints the money. America suffers inflation. Inflation indebtens those that are on the wrong side of the proof of weapons network and benefits those that can borrow at 0% interest through quantitative easing or borrowing against its stock, because it has the relationship with the large banks that create the Wall Street large companies. That means those that are the poorest pay 30% credit card interest or payday loans at 40% predator loans to meet their rent, to prop up the subsidies of the banks that get to create the dollar. They create the dollar through their digital currency backed by debt, so that they get to skim off all the interest from money that they created out of thin air by being a shareholder in the Federal Reserve. They can then bribe the lobbies. That lobbies then leads to rigging the system for the largest companies that they can borrow at 0%. Wealth gets redistributed. Asset prices goes up. Consumer wages doesn't go up. That leads to more unemployment. We get AI that leads to more unemployment. And then you get that as the internal structure. Then you export that globally through the International Monetary Fund and by using organizations and NGOs in order to topple governments, destabilize regions, if you want a textbook operation that has happened recently, look at Bangladesh, create colored revolutions. Then you have your CIA operatives or your Mossad operatives or your MI6 operatives, depending on the region. They fire some guns. That leads to the person that was going to do a deal with China and do a Belt and Road Initiative being expelled. Once they're expelled, you get Mohammed Yunus. Mohammed Yunus creates a debt-based system in Bangladesh. Everybody feels they overthrew the government. It creates carnage. And suddenly you need a US base and an IMF loan in order to have a tied loan where the money goes back into American contractors, which pushes up the price of the dollar increases the deficit, creates more inflation that is exported and exported. And then when it goes wrong and they run out of dollar reserves, you simply get them to print more of their local currency, which then creates more inflation with the local currencies, which then they take their reserves and buy treasuries and lend it to the very same government that overthrew them in the first place. And then you use sanctions if you don't do what they say. And those sanctions cripple the economy, lead to the individuals and people that are already suffering the oppression to have no choice but seeking money by joining a militant group. And then those militant groups are funded by the same organizations. And then the media is used to make these religious warfares that are the same organizations that profit from the open border policy that USAID is all being exposed for right now. And you get to say, we get to say in the West, we have the moral high ground. This is Western ideals. We're exporting democracy, and we're going to send some of our money to save them from the problem we created in the first place. And we use the CIA, deep state, let's call it, in order to believe that they're protecting our national security so that all of this can happen outside parliament, congressional debate, and they can become more powerful because they're representing corporate interest, which pushes up the stock price. And we're told that we need to focus on the left and the right, the Democrats versus the Republicans, the Labour versus Conservative, as every 4 years we say, it's your fault because you're woke. It's your fault because you don't care about the poor and you're corrupt. And eventually that leads to civil unrest. And eventually that leads to a change of empire every 100 years, where external powerful forces that are running surplus, that are not operating off a proof of weapons network, set the new world order. And the very organizations that did that to England with the Bank of England do it to America with the Federal Reserve, and will be launching the stablecoins and central bank digital currencies with whatever the new agenda is. And you get these competing interests as well. Get how it works? And war is the mechanism, which is why the proof of weapons network. It's all about the weapons, the war, the destruction, the violence, and making people believe that we're the good guys when we're funding those people that have no choice but to join your militant groups and join those camps. And how much did USAID fund into training ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban to ensure that those drugs still get exported in an open border policy in order to lead to the civil unrest and the narrative control, so that Elon can spread who the next leader is, so that Elon can get hold of all the data to move into the next technocratic AI-driven stablecoin in a fight against the Fed and the different powers as we move. So then you get to topple governments. You get to replace democracy with dictators and puppet governments. You can see that in Lebanon right now. You can see that everywhere right now. And you need to accept the IMF loan. But then China comes along and says, we won't do that, but we will give you a loan through Belt and Road Initiative. And so anyone that does that, suddenly, like Somalia, oh, right, you're bombing and targeting precision targets on ISIS. When really it's about protecting the resources and ensuring that no one works with the competing power. But now the policy has changed because the proof of weapons network no longer works. The dollar is no longer working. There is a retreat. There is a recognition from looking at the macro and Bitcoin strategies as well. Anyway, all money comes back into US contractors. Stock prices like big pharma, banking, military industrial complex, they all go up. And who controls the voting rights and the board seats? The very cabal that is saying contribute every month to my pension, and BlackRock will manage it and they'll take the voting rights. So rather than you having the voting right in your share, put it in an ETF and we'll take our voting right for you. Essentially proof of stake rather than proof of work, but for stocks. And then we get to bribe the lobbies, and we can have the lobby that looks like they're all supporting Israel when they're all bought. And then if they can't be bought, then we have a blackmail ring like Jeffrey Epstein, which is about to be revealed, which is a Mossad operation. So you can say, do as we say, which was just like the Oslo Accords with Clinton. And then if they don't do that, you can just simply assassinate them if they don't work on the Epstein side. And in order to control the media and make you think that you're the good people, USAID can be used in order to prop up. How do these media companies make money? All right. It turns out it's the funding from the proof of weapons network that caused the inflation that's using the media to fool us into these false narratives. And we are all fighting each other, hating each other, thinking that there's religious wars or ethnic wars or all of these things that are manufactured. Anyway, if you didn't see the headline, I put it on my X. I led to the videos. I can go to all the WikiLeaks that were covered before that. And I can go to now the USAID, which will be on the Doge website hopefully soon, that $600 million of US taxpayer money funded training camps for ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Taliban in order to make sure that the drugs get into the different regions. And those are groups that are manufactured to make you think that they're doing it in the name of Islam so that you can hate the Muslims, so that clean break strategy can be used, which was Netanyahu's Israel first strategy to get America to fight all the wars, which is why 9/11 needed to happen in the first place in order to justify it. So eventually they can get to the final goal of the clean break memo, which is topple Iran for Israel. And American troops do it. American troops are coming back home. They're suffering depression. They're not being looked after by the proof of weapons network. Some of them end up homeless. Some of them end up addicted to the very same drugs that they fought for. And when they have to do all sorts of genocidal crimes in Iraq, like kill 1 million people, they don't come back feeling good about that. And they were doing it because they thought they were doing it for the patriotism of protecting their country from the boogie monster that their taxpayer money created. Pure, unadulterated, evil proof of weapons network. That's why we created Bitcoin. That's why the first block in Bitcoin said banks on the brink of financial disaster. On the Times newspaper that also said Israel are invading Gaza right now. And in a different podcast, I think I'll actually go through my theories on Satoshi as well, because people are asking as well. Anyway, $600 million went into those training camps. And from Israel, because the government is collapsing right now. Why? Because the people want their hostages back, and Netanyahu deliver the hostages back. We had the ex-Israeli war chief, who was the war chief on October the 7th, that did the Hannibal Directive. He confirms that the Hannibal Directive was used in order to kill their own civilians and soldiers on October the 7th. So please watch Atrocity Inc. and stop saying that's a crazy conspiracy theory. It's all being revealed right now. Right, so where are we right now? So let's get back to what's happening at the moment with the peace negotiations, and then we can wrap up the geopolitical section. So last weekend, after last week's broadcast, there were 3 Israeli hostages that were swapped for 183 Palestinian hostages that never went through due process and were in administrative detention where they were tortured and sexual violence was used. And they are still being arrested in the West Bank at a faster rate than they're coming out in Gaza right now. Even though, remember, there's no Hamas in the West Bank, so they're doing it anyway because you're all distracted with all the executive orders. And that's all being hid. So the Palestinian hostages, they looked absolutely awful. They shared their stories. Every accusation is a confession. The things you said were happening to Israelis on October the 7th have been happening to the Palestinians. And then Trump and Netanyahu were used in order to push out a narrative that they were treated so badly and they looked so badly, even though they were on the stage in good condition. They looked very healthy. So why are you being lied to? Because the media is controlled by organizations like USAID and other NGOs. So the traditional media completely engages in the cover-up story exactly as it has. We now know that that's bought by intelligence. And we have had the fifth hostage exchange. And that has been happening smoothly. Now, this week, it wasn't so smoothly. Hamas, they came out and they suspended the hostage exchange until Israel follows what was agreed in the original commitment. So the problem is that since the ceasefire, Israel has killed 91 Palestinians, 25 of them in the last couple of weeks. So they haven't maintained the ceasefire. And the agreement was that the mobile homes and the tents come in order to give people shelter through the horrible storms. Only 2% was delivered. And remember, the media was telling us aid's coming in, it's flooding in. No, they were weaponizing starvation to try and get rid of as many as possible. We've now got 2.3 million Palestinians that are 1.7 million, probably 600,000 of them going to be found under the rubble, starving, famine, whatever it may be. And only 2% of the aid came in, even though that was part of the ceasefire agreement. The Israeli government said exactly what they're going to do, which is the Likud party, which is Netanyahu's coalition government. They said, we need you to go back to war. We don't want the hostages back. Once the hostages come back, we lose leverage. And the Israeli families are all protesting, bring them home, bring them home. We know that you're trying to sabotage the deal. They're saying we need to go back to war. And if they're saying that Netanyahu will be overthrown if he does not deliver the return to the war in phase 2, because they want the complete elimination of all Palestinians. And so phase 2 is currently being negotiated. They paused the ceasefire, saying until the aid comes in, we're not going to do the hostage swap this weekend. Trump and Netanyahu were pushing out the USAID funding narrative, the Fox narrative, the CNN narrative, the BBC narrative, and all the others. Basically, Trump said, here's my strategy. America's going to own Gaza. Then he said, I'm going to own Gaza. And Jordan and Egypt are going to take all the Palestinians, and they're not going to be able to come back. There will be no right to return. We're then, in the next few weeks, going to discuss our West Bank strategy, which will probably lead to, we're going to annex the West Bank, which is 3.5 million Palestinians that have got nothing to do with Hamas. They're run by the Palestinian Authority, a puppet government that was installed. And Israel funded Hamas in order to try and overthrow the PLO and the PA, to try and make sure that the region's always in war, so that it could get to the situation that we are in today. Trump says the Palestinians won't have the right to return. And so part of USAID is to defund UNRWA. UNRWA controls the right to return for all the diaspora, the diaspora Palestinians, so they can get rid of that right. And then he declassified the illegal Israeli settlers that are terrorizing Palestinians, burning down their homes in the West Bank, nothing to do with human shields or anything. And then they're be bulldozing their homes and replacing them with Israeli settlers so that Israelis can move in, completely illegal. And that was determined in the international court. The international court said these are complete illegal occupations. So Trump then says, because he received the 150 million from Adelson, we're going to sanction the ICC court and the ICJ court that ruled there is a plausible genocide. Remember, one of the judges had to complain that they were being blackmailed by Mossad because they said their family were going to be killed if they didn't vote in the right direction. That was all revealed, but the judges ended up resisting the Mossad operations, and they were ruled with plausible genocide because South Africa took the case forward and other jurisdictions joined the case. Trump, not talking about any of that, said, I will own Gaza. And that lines with the Kushner deal with the fund that was funded by the Saudis in order to see this as a real estate transaction. Didn't say America will own it, but we'll see. Look, I think this is posturing to get to the deal, the art of the deal, as it were. But it could create absolute carnage in the region. As I said, in order to understand Trump is my new model, you just got to follow how he makes money and how he'll profit. And then I think you can understand the things that he says. As he's done with crypto, as I covered in the crypto section, as he's done with macro, as I covered in the macro section, and why he needs to get rates down for the real estate deals. And I think it's the same for geopolitics as well. And I think that he's dreaming about deploying some of that capital from Saudi through the Kushner fund, his son-in-law, in order to buy some real estate, beachside real estate in Gaza, and maybe even build like one of those Dubai offshore in the sea islands where you can make an artificial island right next to the gas exploration as well. So it can be done through that. So I think he just wants to do a deal. Now, I think he knows, and I do believe he knows, in fact, yes, he knows, that you cannot deploy troops, you cannot have a US occupation of the West Bank. So I think this is posturing, because he knows that if you put US troops there, there is a resistance. You can see from the hostage swap that Hamas are still there. They've been underground. They've been pretending while they're destroying and killing civilians and all of the land, so that you can destroy it, bulldoze the whole thing, and rebuild a smart city with artificial intelligence, with all of the Palantir technology that is doing occupation as a service, which will be exported around the world based upon probably a central bank digital currency or a stable coin, whatever it does, rather than building it on top of Bitcoin so they can remain sovereign. Yeah. So, I think he knows that that's very, very unrealistic, but Israel would like US troops so that the resistance can happen, which is why Israel funded it through Qatar in the first place, so it can kill American troops. American troops can fight back harder. That leads to a further resistance from Iran-led proxies in Lebanon and in Iraq and various other regions. And then Israel can come harder with America there. And then they can say, you've got to get Iran, you've got to take them out. And then that will lead to another forever war with massive aspirations from Israel to probably take some of the land in Saudi Arabia, which is why we got a comment from Netanyahu. And let's look at that so we can follow that. So one of the Israeli government people, Ben Gvir, basically said that he called on the government to immediately, after the ceasefire was suspended, to basically do an assault on Gaza and kill more civilians. So he wanted to use that to go straight back in. Ben Gvir recommended, basically they were rejected, because I do believe that there is an alternative competing plan as well. That's the Israel first policy. I'm hoping that there is a reason that is following here, because Saudi Arabia and the GCC are applying some of their power. And I'm not saying they're doing it because, they care about the Palestinians. I know the people do. They certainly do. They want to normalize with Israel and get on with business. But the people will revolt because they need the Palestinian cause. And Israel would much rather the revolutions in the different countries, which is why it's better for the region to be red hot. So Trump puts out that narrative. And if there is a revolution within Egypt or Jordan, because the people can't take it anymore, then you can have a 2011 style Muslim Brotherhood operation where you co-opt your proxies and you replace the leadership with your leadership. And then you end up with those that are going to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. So That is one direction that I think Israel wants us to go. And I'm hoping that we can go for the peaceful direction, which is avoiding World War III. So Trump put out the narrative, and he said, unless all hostages are released by 12 noon tomorrow, EST, I think it was, then all hell will break loose. And he said, I don't want drips and drabs. I want all of them. That's not going to happen. So now it gets to test Trump's request. And if this caves in, it means that the resistance still has power. If it leads to all hell breaking loose, then it means that Trump is serious and we're moving to the direction that could take us to World War III. If there is a swap and it doesn't lead to the escalation, then I think we're moving towards the direction of a peaceful region. Now, that could be disrupted at any time because Netanyahu, he came out and said, if Hamas does not return our hostages by Saturday at noon, and he said hostages, that could be 3 of them so he can save face, which was the agreement, or it could be all of them in order to go with the Trump narrative. Then the ceasefire will end and the IDF will resume intense fighting until Hamas is completely defeated. Okay, so what happened? Well, Israel capitulated. So that implies to me there are forces, whatever those forces are, that are forcing a plan. They capitulated because immediately after that, after all that posturing, all of the aid started coming in, all of the homes, all of the mobile homes, all of the tents, and suddenly they were capitulated. So there is agenda that's pushing for peace as well. Hamas now announced today the 3 hostages that they will be releasing. And now we have this whole thing. If the Palestinians, and this goes ahead tomorrow, and the Palestinian hostages are released, and it is done by 3, then it has shown that the resistance is in control of the narrative to some degree. And Trump didn't get his wishes. The Israeli government didn't get their wishes. The protesters in Israel got their wishes, and this could prevent a revolution in Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and toppling of those regions. And we don't need to go through US troops occupying Gaza and causing absolute carnage in the region and the regional war. So that is my next yardstick. If we get the hostage swap that happened tomorrow, then I believe we are on the right track for actual Saudi Arabia and the GCC getting a 2-state solution against Israel's wishes. And then I think America not occupying Gaza and being in another forever war that they can't afford. So the ceasefire is back on for now, and we have to watch what happens tomorrow, and I'll cover it next week so that you can follow the money rather than following the narrative as well. But remember, the Israeli government could fall apart if they don't get war again. So they need war in order for Netanyahu to manage that. And Trump, remember, he agreed to $7 billion for the Israeli protection. So the proof of weapons network is still being funded via the old model. We still got all the Zionists in US Congress calling it Judea and Samaria and wanting to return the Samaya by rebuilding the temple on Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so you still got that narrative. So there are competing narratives. And then you've got USAID revealing. So it is a pretty wild time, and I think it's moving to the AI side, as I said. But, the peaceful process, remember, they've also doubled down on sanctions on Iran, which is a process that could lead to Israel getting what they want, and America fighting a war against Iran and doing regime change. They also sanctioned the ICJ, which is the plausible genocide case. They sanctioned the ICC, which is the illegal occupation. Trump's doing that. If they wanted peace, then they would remove all of that and do what they're doing with all the other regions, remove aid to Israel and use their soft power with the GCC in order to make it happen. Now, Trump did a bit of posturing. The King of Jordan, who is an MI6 implant, that also is looking after many of the Palestinian refugees from previous crises. He came to visit the White House, and Trump looked to do a humiliation exercise. He conceded slightly, saying we'll take in 2,000 children that are suffering from cancer, that are critically ill. Beautiful thing to do. But it was like a concede slightly, as if Trump's going to get his ethnic cleansing that he was his demands. But at the same time, he said, I'm going to work with Egypt and the GCC, and we're going to release our plan. The people in Egypt and Jordan enraged by it. The military is being deployed in order to try and control people so they don't have that uprising. And Trump's word is causing absolute carnage across the region. Egypt and Jordan moved more military to try and prevent the revolution so that they don't end up with a war. And what did Netanyahu do? He came out and said, Saudi should take the Palestinians because they've got tons of land. The Saudi leadership were absolutely enraged by those comments. That can lead an uprising. They are trying to prevent a revolution of their monarch. And without a two-state solution, which is why they have to get the two-state solution in order to get the deal that Trump wants. And that means that we have to make sure that Israel doesn't get World War III and a overthrow of carnage and the Greater Israel Project, which includes parts of Saudi Arabia, parts of Jordan, parts of Egypt, the West Bank, Syria, parts of Syria, parts of Lebanon, Israel as it stands right now, and Gaza. And we're seeing all of that being delivered. So,
there's no one named Lebanon, Israel, who shares
look, the proof of weapons network AI is Syria is coming after me. Anyway, we're coming to the end of the geopolitical section. Anyway, Saudi is red hot right now. Jordan, red hot. Egypt, red hot. Tensions are absolutely wild, and military is being deployed to make sure that these revolutions don't happen, which will lead to death and destruction like it did in Arab Spring in 2011. What everyone needs to do is trade with BRICS, essentially. And Trump needs to exert his force, which I hope that he's doing. And I hope that we don't get this Zionist agenda that takes us to the violence that I think could come when you follow the money at the moment. The deal could be negotiated between Ukraine and Russia, which is happening in Saudi Arabia. And so I think all eyes are on that. We need to make sure that there is no uprisings. We need to make sure that ceasefire continues. We need to watch what phase 2 actually entails. And we need to make sure that cooler heads prevail. And we don't get that uprising in Egypt. And we do get a genuine two-state solution, which hopefully there's no Epstein bribes. That's why we need to watch the Epstein files, because unfortunately, Trump and Epstein did a lot of deals together. And Trump was on the Epstein plane. And we have seen the various bankers and financial institutions and JP Morgans and Jamie Dimons that are all contained on that list. So this is why I'm very scared of the tension between a pro-Zionist person being in charge of revealing all those files, because we need the truth. Without truth, we won't have peace. We can't have peace without truth. So let's see. In the meantime, there's some posturing. Trump came out and said we'll wage war on South Africa. In the meantime, that they're doing massive human rights violation. I'm not saying that they're not. They have their own struggles, but we know that that was for Israel. We're also getting the US installed Lebanese government that is saying Hezbollah can no longer be a part of it. On the 18th of February is when the ceasefire, after the extension, after Israel violated the ceasefire agreement in Lebanon, the peace agreement, it extended it to 8th of February. If they don't move out by 18th of February, then they're in violation again, and they're going to have a permanent occupation in Lebanon, I'm sure is part of the deal. Just as they said, we're doing a permanent occupation in Syria right now, and Syria, whose ex-ISIS leader, who's wearing a suit, is going to be negotiating with all the leaders right now who was funded through USAID, that was part of training all of those death camps, that was using USAID money, that then used with Turkey to build the rebel group in order to do the overthrow of the Assad regime, because so many people in Syria hated the Assad regime. That's leading to where we are right now. So all eyes on Lebanon. There's a 24-minister government, and recognize that what we are witnessing right now is the transition from the world order of the dollar proof of weapons network, the petrodollar, the euro dollar, based upon deceit and violence of the CIA, funded by the money printing of the Federal Reserve, exported globally through the International Monetary Fund and the Bank for International Settlements, that has all these deep states in other regions that consolidate power into these, into central bank digital currencies, that is competing with a globalist technocrat artificial intelligence vision, and we are replacing one evil with another evil. This is the proof of weapons network. We're going to see, if it's in charge, if it's replaced. But we're getting lots of narratives around the fake war on terror 2.0 right now. Be very, very wary of any attacks that happen within your country that are being blamed onto refugees and illegal immigrants. You can bet your bottom dollar that they might be intelligence operations in order to build up the hate that is required in order for Elon Musk to suddenly push that narrative forward, so that your government can be toppled by somebody that's going to say mega, and give all that data for your version of Doge, which you may or may not want, that will reveal the corruption, but hand all the data over to artificial intelligence. And how do we resist? We resist by Bitcoin and by having decentralized open source technology so that we can control the artificial intelligence and see what's actually happening. So as I said, the second evil narrative in the macro, the new, you get what you want by exposing the corruption. The conspiracy theorists were right. Now we're proving that they're true. Is that essentially they are killing the Epstein blackmail network. They're revealing the old system, and they're replacing it with a Peter Thiel, Mossad, CIA, Elon Musk, digitally central bank digital currency, stable coin, technocratic new power structure, where the central banks through CBDs compete with stable coins through technocrats and AIA data. And they need you to believe that it was Biden, Genocide Joe, and Kamala Harris, Holocaust Harris, that did it all. And it wasn't a multi left and right big operation. I don't mind. You can take it, blame it on the Democrats. They were corrupt as hell. And Biden needs punishment for what he did. He killed all those children. And Harris did all those, allowing the illegal borders to happen. Completely complicit in the process. So that Trump and Elon and the PayPal mafia can come in and save everybody, so that we beg them to give them their AI data, because we want the proof of weapons network to be exposed. And all we need to do is recognize it and protect ourselves with Bitcoin. So essentially, we're replacing, all of these bureaucratic inefficiencies with artificial intelligence, which will do all the mass government unemployment, and will give all the data that's needed for Palantir to give it to all of the governments globally. And we have this AI warfare, and hopefully we can build open source decentralized AI that uses Bitcoin as peaceful proof of work as the resistance continues, as it started with the release of the white paper in 2008 to the cypherpunks, with the protection of WikiLeaks through Julian Assange using Bitcoin as the financial blockade happened. with the fact that we're now getting these Bitcoin strategic reserves with the countries that are being protected from that, to protect the world from digital communism powered by artificial intelligence, deep state, deep data governments that want all of the energy that's needed to power for this whole thing. And with that in mind, we need to prepare. So I hope you enjoyed Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 70. I do think it's a very interesting time for change. Make sure you help me like, share, spread this. We'll cut this up into 3 so you can pick the one you want, either Bitcoin, macro, or geopolitics, or share the whole thing. I know they're long. We're trying to make them so you can share that. But always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Some are going to get wrecked. Others are going to do really well. And we need to use peace, love, and unity to fight against that, which I believe is peaceful proof of work. Boycott the system, take your proof of weapons currency, save in Bitcoin proof of work, learn self-custody, and spend local. Remember that the entire system is fueled by debt. So if you can get out of debt, I'll join you this time next week. Spend less than you earn, save the difference in Bitcoin. And I'll see you this time next week in Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 71. Peace.